My daughter-in-law stood on the marble steps of the church, blocking the heavy oak doors. She looked at my faded suit, then at the wealthy guests whispering behind her. "There is no place for a filthy old man like you here," she said, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You are going to ruin my perfect family photos with your pathetic display of poverty." The crowd fell silent. Everyone waited for me to cause a scene. I looked at my son, the boy I broke my back to raise, hoping he would defend his father. He simply looked away and took a sip of his champagne. I did not argue. I did not beg. I just nodded and walked away. But the moment I turned my back, the grieving father died, and the man who secretly funded their entire luxurious existence woke up. By the next morning, their perfect world would be completely shattered. I am Tyrone Jenkins, 74 years old, and I learned the hard way that blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. Before I tell you how I tore down my son's empire brick by brick, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting the people who sacrificed for you should always come with a heavy price. The morning of my grandson Leo's baptism was unseasonably warm for Atlanta. I drove my rusted 1998 Ford pickup truck through the towering iron gates of the most exclusive church in the city. My truck groaned and rattled as I parked it between a row of gleaming Mercedes and sleek Teslas. I stepped out and smoothed down the lapels of my dark brown suit. It was the only formal suit I owned. It was entirely out of style, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, but it was spotless. I had spent an hour ironing it that morning, wanting to look presentable for my grandson's special day. I walked up the long, sweeping stone pathway toward the massive stained glass windows. The courtyard was already filled with the local elite. Men in custom-tailored suits and women in designer silk dresses stood in small circles, laughing and holding crystal flutes of morning champagne. These were my daughter-in-law's people. Brittany came from what she liked to call old Southern money, though I always knew her family's wealth was mostly built on debt and smoke and mirrors. Still, she played the part of the wealthy socialite perfectly. I kept my head high, walking with the slow, deliberate limp that 40 years of working as a commercial plumber had given me. I could feel the eyes of the crowd sliding over me. I heard the hushed whispers passing from ear to ear. I saw the discreet pointing from behind manicured hands. To them, I was just an old, working-class black man who had somehow wandered into the wrong neighborhood. They did not know that the very ground they were standing on, the commercial district surrounding this church, was part of a real estate portfolio I owned. They only saw the frayed cuffs of my jacket and the deep calluses on my hands. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw my son Andre holding little Leo. My heart swelled with a deep, quiet joy. I had not seen the boy in over 3 months because Brittany always found an excuse to cancel my visits. I took a step forward, raising my hand to wave at my son, but a figure stepped directly into my path. It was Brittany. She wore a tailored white designer dress, her neck draped in thick pearls, her blonde hair perfectly styled. But her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered contempt. "Where do you think you are going, Tyrone?" she asked, her voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. I smiled gently, trying to keep the peace for the sake of the baby. "I am here for my grandson, Brittany. It is a big day for the family, and I wanted to drop off my gift." Her eyes scanned me from head to toe, resting on my scuffed leather shoes with a look of physical revulsion. "Family," she repeated, letting out a short, mocking laugh. "Look at yourself. You look like a homeless man who wandered off the street. This is an exclusive private event. My parents invited their corporate partners, city council members, and wealthy investors. I will not have you embarrassing us by standing around looking like a janitor." I kept my voice calm, gripping the small wrapped box I had brought for Leo. "I am Andre's father. I have a right to be here to see the boy get baptized." Brittany took a step closer, invading my personal space. The scent of her expensive floral perfume was suffocating. "You have no rights here," she hissed, her blue eyes narrowing. "There is no place for a filthy old man like you in our world. You are going to ruin my perfect family photos with your pathetic display of poverty. Now turn around and walk back to that piece of junk truck before I have the security guards drag you off the property." The harshness of her words echoed in the sudden silence of the courtyard. The guests standing nearby had completely stopped talking. They were all watching the scene unfold. Some looked amused, others uncomfortable, but absolutely no one intervened. I looked past Brittany's shoulder, seeking out the one person who should have put an end to this blatant disrespect. my son. Andre was standing just 10 feet away. He was a 42-year-old man dressed in a $4,000 suit wearing a luxury watch I knew his company could not actually afford. I looked him dead in the eye. I waited for him to hand the baby to the nanny to step forward to tell his wife that you do not ever speak to the man who gave you everything in that manner. Andre met my gaze for a fraction of a second. I saw the shame flash across his face. I saw the hesitation in his posture. But then he made his choice. He deliberately turned his head. He looked away, lifted his champagne flute to his lips, and began chatting with a wealthy investor as if his father did not exist. He chose his wife's vanity. He chose the fragile illusion of high society over the father who had worked double shifts in the freezing rain so he could attend a prestigious university. That turn of his head was the most painful thing I have ever experienced. It hurt worse than any physical injury I had sustained in my long life. But the pain only lasted for a fleeting moment. Then something inside my chest turned to absolute ice. The warmth of a loving father evaporated, leaving behind a cold, calculating businessman. I looked back at Brittany. Her chin was raised, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully bullied a helpless, broke old man who had no power to fight back. I did not raise my voice. I did not cause the scene she was secretly hoping for to justify her cruelty. I just looked deep into her arrogant eyes, nodded my head once, and turned around. I walked back down those marble steps with steady, measured strides. I did not look back. I heard the murmurs of the crowd starting up again, the clinking of glasses resuming as I reached my rusty truck. I climbed inside, put the key in the ignition, and listened to the old engine roar to life. As I drove away from the church, leaving my son and my grandson behind, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. I had spent years playing the role of the humble, struggling father to keep Andre grounded. I thought if he saw me living simply, he would learn the value of hard work. When he started his technology firm, I secretly funded his company through anonymous shell corporations, protecting his fragile ego while ensuring he succeeded. I had let Brittany believe she was superior, because I simply did not care about her shallow judgments. But today, they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I thought about the 1980s when banks in Atlanta would not give a commercial loan to a black man in overalls. I remembered taking my hard-earned cash buying abandoned warehouses in areas nobody wanted and quietly holding on to them until the city expanded. I built an empire in absolute silence. I kept my wealth hidden, but my silence had not made my son humble. It had made him arrogant. It had made him weak enough to let a toxic woman control him. I drove straight back to my modest brick house in the quiet suburbs. The moment I walked through the front door, I took off the faded brown suit jacket and tossed it onto a chair. I walked into my home office, a room Andre and Brittany had never bothered to look inside because they thought it just held old plumbing receipts. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk, picked up my secure phone, and dialed a number I kept on speed dial. The phone rang twice before a sharp professional voice answered the line. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," my lead corporate attorney said. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the family portrait sitting on my desk. It was an old picture of me and Andre from when he was just a young boy, smiling and full of promise. I reached out and laid the picture face down on the wood. "Activate Protocol Theta," I said, my voice completely empty of any emotion. "I want you to cut off every single line of funding to my son's business. Freeze the anonymous venture capital accounts. Withdraw the silent backing from his company. I want it all dismantled." The lawyer did not hesitate, though his tone grew serious. "Are you absolutely certain, sir? This will cause immediate and catastrophic financial failure for his technology firm. He will not survive the week." I thought about Brittany's smirk. I thought about the coldness in her eyes when she called me a filthy old man. I thought about Andre turning his face away, pretending not to know me. "I am certain," I replied coldly. "Cut them off entirely. Do it tonight." I hung up the phone and poured myself a cup of black coffee. The time for pretending to be a poor, helpless old man was officially over. I stood in the center of my dimly lit bedroom and slowly took off the worn brown suit. I folded the jacket with precise, practiced movements and laid it across the back of a wooden chair. It was the suit of a humble man, a man who knew his place, a man who was supposed to be a burden on his sophisticated, upwardly mobile family. That was exactly what my daughter-in-law needed me to be. Brittany needed a villain for her social narrative, a pathetic, uneducated old man to look down on so she could feel incredibly tall in her expensive designer shoes. I walked over to the mirror and looked closely at my reflection. My hair was gray, my face lined with decades of hard physical labor, my hands heavily scarred from wrenching iron pipes and digging through concrete floors. I looked exactly like a tired old plumber. And for the longest time, that was exactly what I wanted my son to see. I wanted him to see the dirt under my fingernails. I wanted him to understand that $1 is earned with blood, sweat, and relentless time. I wanted him to respect the grind, but as he grew older, he only saw the dirt. He never bothered to look at the massive foundation underneath it. I turned away from the mirror, poured myself a glass of cold water, and walked down the hall into my home office. I flipped the light switch. The walls of this room were lined with heavy steel filing cabinets, thick with corporate contracts, property deeds, and offshore asset portfolios. 40 years ago, the world was a very unforgiving place for a man who looked like me. I was a young black man in Atlanta, with calloused hands, a heavy steel toolbox, and a vision that nobody else could see. I remembered walking into the towering glass banks downtown, wearing my cleanest button-down shirt, asking for a simple commercial loan to start a business. The loan officers would look at me, smile their polite, hollow smiles, and stamp my applications denied without a second thought, every single time. They told me the market was too volatile. They told me I lacked the proper collateral, but I knew exactly what they were really saying. They looked at my skin, they looked at my blue-collar trade, and they decided I was not a builder of empires. So I stopped asking them for permission. I went back to fixing their leaking pipes, unclogging their flooded drains, and crawling under their luxurious houses in the dead of winter. I worked brutal 18-hour days. I saved every single penny that did not go toward keeping a roof over my family. And when the great economic crisis hit in the late 80s, when those same arrogant bankers were scrambling to liquidate their distressed assets, I was waiting quietly in the shadows. I bought abandoned warehouses in forgotten industrial districts. I bought massive empty lots covered in weeds and broken glass. I bought the crumbling commercial properties that nobody else wanted, paying strictly in cash. People in my own neighborhood called me crazy. They said I was throwing my hard-earned plumbing money directly into the dirt. But cities always expand. The forgotten industrial zones I purchased for pennies eventually became premium commercial real estate. Those abandoned warehouses are now luxury lofts, high-end retail spaces, and corporate tech hubs. My empire grew in absolute silence, entirely free of banking debt. I became a ghost in the financial world. I set up anonymous trusts, holding groups and shell companies. I did not buy a sprawling mansion in the hills. I did not buy a fleet of exotic sports cars. I kept driving my rusty Ford truck and living in the same modest brick house I had bought with my late wife. I learned early on that true power does not need to scream its presence when it walks into a room. But my son Andre chose a vastly different path. When he launched his software development company 5 years ago, he wanted to be seen as a young tech visionary. He wanted the glowing magazine covers, the corner office with the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lavish lifestyle. He married Brittany, a woman who demanded a standard of living that his fragile startup could not legally or logically sustain. They leased an expensive penthouse downtown. They bought matching luxury vehicles they could not afford. They threw extravagant parties that cost more than what most families earn in a year. And when his company was on the verge of total catastrophic collapse 2 years ago, I intervened. But I did not hand him a personal check. I knew his massive ego could not handle taking a financial handout from his blue-collar father. He would have felt humiliated. So I used one of my anonymous venture capital firms to quietly inject $2 million into his failing company. I saved his business from bankruptcy. I funded his lavish lifestyle. I literally paid for the very designer dress Brittany wore when she looked me in the eye and called me a filthy old man on the church steps. They were living like absolute royalty on my hidden dime while treating me like a peasant who was not worthy of standing in their presence. I slept incredibly deep that night. It was the kind of heavy, dreamless sleep that only comes when a massive burden has finally been lifted from your shoulders. I woke up at exactly 6 in the morning, right as the golden sun began to peek through the window blinds. The house was perfectly quiet. I walked into the kitchen, filled the kettle with water, and began to brew my morning coffee. I liked it black, strong, and exceptionally bitter. Just as I poured the steaming water over the dark coffee grounds, a sharp, aggressive buzzing sound broke the peaceful silence. My cell phone was vibrating violently against the granite countertop, spinning in small circles. I walked over slowly and picked it up. The screen was lit up brightly with notifications. 47 missed calls. Every single one of them was from Andre. In addition to the missed calls, there were dozens of text messages, each one more frantic and desperate than the last. Dad, call me immediately. Dad, please pick up the phone right now. Dad, it is a massive emergency. Call me back. I stood there staring at the glowing screen, letting the phone continue to buzz in the palm of my hand. He had not called me 47 times in the entire past 10 years combined, but today, on this specific morning, he suddenly remembered he had a father. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee, letting the bitter, robust taste settle on my tongue. The phone stopped buzzing for a brief second, then immediately started ringing again. Andre. I did not rush. I set my coffee mug down on the counter, pressed the green button, and held the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I did not offer a greeting. I simply listened to the chaos on the other end of the line. Dad, Andre shouted, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. The arrogant, untouchable tech CEO from the church courtyard was entirely gone. Dad, thank God. You have to help me right now. The anonymous investment fund backing my company, they just pulled their $2 million out of nowhere. There was no warning. The corporate bank accounts are completely frozen. The entire payroll just bounced. I am going bankrupt, Dad. I am going to lose absolutely everything. I stood in my quiet kitchen watching the morning light reflect off the surface of my dark coffee. I did not feel pity. I did not feel the sudden urge to rush to my son's rescue. I took another slow, deliberate sip from my mug. Is that so? I replied, my voice completely flat cold and utterly calm. That is too bad. The silent hum of an expensive electric engine pulling into my driveway was the exact sound of desperation. I stood by the front window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. Andre and Brittany were stepping out of their sleek white Tesla. The streetlights caught the panic in my son's hurried movements. Brittany was right behind him, carrying a pink bakery box tied with a satin ribbon. Just 12 hours ago, this same woman had stood on the steps of a marble church and declared that a filthy old man like me had no place in her world. Now she was marching up to my front door bearing expensive pastries. Hypocrisy has a very distinct smell, and tonight it smelled like vanilla frosting and fear. Before I opened the door, I made sure the stage was perfectly set. I placed a worn manila folder on the coffee table, leaving it slightly open so the edges of the financial documents inside were visible. They were bank statements I had printed out that afternoon. They were completely fake, expertly fabricated to show a humble savings account with a balance of $34,000. It was exactly the kind of modest nest egg they expected a retired plumber to have. I shuffled toward the door, letting my shoulders slump. I slowed my breathing. I transformed myself back into the fragile, simple old man they believed me to be. I opened the door, and the performance began. Andre forced a smile that looked painful on his stressed face. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice artificially bright. "We know it is late, but we wanted to come by and see you." Brittany stepped forward, her expensive perfume filling my small hallway. She completely ignored the fact that she had publicly humiliated me that very morning. "Oh, Pops, it is so good to see you," she cooed, her voice dripping with a sickening sweetness. "We brought you some of those cherry tarts you like from the bakery downtown. We felt just awful that we did not get to spend quality time with you at the baptism today. It was just so chaotic, you know how these social events get." I looked at her perfectly painted lips, amazed at how effortlessly she could lie. I did not invite them in immediately. I let them stand on the porch for an uncomfortable few seconds, watching the anxiety build in their eyes. Then I stepped aside and nodded. "Come on in," I murmured, my voice raspy and weak. They walked into my living room looking completely out of place among my faded furniture and old family photographs. They sat down stiffly on my worn sofa. Brittany placed the bakery box on the coffee table, her eyes immediately darting toward the manila folder sitting just a few inches away. I saw the calculation in her gaze. She was like a predator spotting a wounded animal. I sat slowly in my recliner, rubbing my knees as if my joints were aching. "What brings you two out here this time of night?" I asked, keeping my gaze lowered. Andre leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked completely exhausted. The tailored suit he wore could not hide the fact that his entire empire was currently burning to the ground. "Dad, I am going to be straight with you," he began, rubbing the back of his neck. "My company has hit a tiny little roadblock. It is nothing serious, just a temporary cash flow issue. We are transitioning between major investors, and there is a slight delay with the bank transfers. A tiny little roadblock. That was how he described losing $2 million in anonymous funding. Brittany chimed in, leaning closer and offering a sympathetic pout. It is just a terrible misunderstanding with the banks, Pops. But you know how stressful it is running a huge technology firm. Andre has hundreds of employees depending on him. We just need a little bridge loan to cover payroll and some personal expenses for a few days until the new capital clears. I kept my expression blank, acting as though I barely understood the big financial terms they were using. How much do you need? I asked softly. Andre shifted uncomfortably. He looked at Brittany, then back at me. We were hoping to borrow $30,000, Dad. I know you have that old retirement savings account from your plumbing days. We will pay you back with 20% interest by next Friday. I promise. You will not even notice it is gone. $30,000. It was a pathetic request for a man who had been burning through hundreds of thousands of my dollars a month. I knew exactly why they needed that specific amount. It was not for his employees. It was to cover the balloon payment on their luxury penthouse, the lease on their Tesla, and the minimum payments on Brittany's maxed-out credit cards. They were drowning, and they wanted to drain my small imaginary puddle to save themselves for one more week. I looked down at my rough hands intertwining my fingers. I let out a long, heavy sigh. Andre, you know I love you, I said, making my voice tremble just a little bit. But I cannot do that. That money is all I have left in this world. Dad, please, Andre begged, the fake composure starting to crack. I will give it right back. It is completely guaranteed. I slowly shook my head. My heart medication just went up again, I explained, looking at him with the eyes of a frightened senior citizen. The doctors say I need to start a new blood pressure treatment next month. Groceries are getting so expensive. If I give you that money and something goes wrong, I will not be able to afford my pills. I am sorry, son. I need that money to stay alive. The rejection hung in the air. I watched the masks slip from their faces. Andre ran a hand over his face, a gesture of pure frustration. He looked at me not with the understanding of a loving son, but with the irritation of an entitled child being denied a toy. Brittany could not hide her disgust. The sweet, caring daughter-in-law vanished instantly. Her jaw tightened, and she looked at my worn clothes with the same revulsion she had shown at the church. Pops, she said, her voice dropping its sugary tone and becoming tight and demanding. You are living in a paid-off house. You do not have any real expenses. Andre is on the verge of losing everything he has worked for. You cannot just sit on a pile of cash while your own son loses his company. It is incredibly selfish. Selfish. That was the word she chose. The woman who wore a diamond necklace paid for by my secret funds was calling me selfish for protecting my imaginary medical money. I am tired, I said, gripping the arms of my recliner and slowly pulling myself up to a standing position. I need to take my evening pills. Let me go to the kitchen and get some water. We can talk more in a minute. I did not wait for their response. I turned my back to them and shuffled slowly down the hallway toward the kitchen. The moment I was out of their line of sight, I dropped the hunched posture. I stood up straight, pulled my smartphone out of my pocket, and opened the security application. I had installed a high-definition hidden camera in the bookshelf across from the sofa earlier that afternoon. The live video feed popped up on my screen showing Andre and Brittany alone in my living room. I turned up the volume on my earpiece to listen. This is useless, Andre hissed, throwing his hands up in the air. The stubborn old fool is not going to give us a dime. I told you this was a waste of time. He is too paranoid about his stupid heart pills. Brittany leaned back on the sofa, crossing her arms. Her face was a portrait of pure malice. I cannot believe we are sitting in this dump begging a plumber for pennies, she whispered sharply. We need that money, Andre. We are going to lose the penthouse by Tuesday if we do not wire the funds. Then what do you want me to do? Andre whispered back angrily. Put a gun to his head. I cannot force him to sign a check. Brittany did not answer him right away. On my phone screen, I watched her eyes shift toward the manila folder sitting on the coffee table. The bait. She leaned forward, checking the hallway to make sure I was not coming back. Then, moving quickly and quietly, she flipped open the cover of the folder. Her eyes scanned the fake bank statement I had printed. A slow, wicked smile spread across her face. Oh, he has it, she whispered. $34,200. It is sitting right there in a standard savings account at the local branch. Leave it alone, Brittany Andre warned nervously. He is going to come back. Shut up, she snapped. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her smartphone. She held it over the documents, her face twisted with a mix of greed and absolute contempt. She snapped 3 quick photos of the bank account numbers, the routing information, and the signature line at the bottom of the page. We do not need him to write a check, Andre, she whispered, tucking her phone back into her purse just as quickly as she had taken it out. He is old. He is confused. He forgets things all the time. He told us he was having memory issues last week, remember? Andre stared at her, the realization dawning on his face. Are you crazy? He whispered back. We are surviving, she corrected him coldly. We take the information. We wire the funds ourselves. By the time he realizes the money is gone, we will have secured the new investor and we can put it back. And if he notices before then, we just tell him he must have transferred it and forgotten. Who is a bank going to believe? A prominent tech CEO or a senile old man who cannot even remember his own medication schedule? I stood in the darkness of my kitchen watching the entire exchange on my glowing screen. I watched them justify stealing the last imaginary pennies from an old man to save their luxury lifestyle. They had taken the bait perfectly. They had crossed the line from ungrateful children to absolute criminals. I smiled, feeling a cold, dark satisfaction settle deep in my bones. I put the phone back in my pocket, grabbed a glass of water, and began the slow, shuffling walk back to the living room. They wanted to play a game of deception, but they had absolutely no idea that they had just walked into a trap I had designed exclusively for them. The knock on my front door came at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. It was not a friendly knock. It was heavy, rhythmic, and demanding. The kind of knock that belongs to someone carrying a badge or a clipboard. I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking a cup of black coffee and reviewing the hidden camera footage from the night before. I watched Brittany snap photos of my fake bank statements on my phone screen one last time before closing the application. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my plaid shirt, and walked slowly toward the door. I opened the door to find a woman in her late 30s standing on my porch. She wore a sharp gray suit, flat shoes, and an expression of practiced clinical concern. She held a thick leather binder pressed against her chest. "Good morning," she said, her voice tight. "Are you Mr. Tyrone Jenkins?" I smiled gently, leaning against the doorframe. "Yes, ma'am. That is me. How can I help you today?" She cleared her throat, shifting her weight awkwardly. "Mr. Jenkins, my name is Valerie. I am an investigator with Adult Protective Services. We received an anonymous phone call late last night regarding your living conditions and your overall well-being. I am required by law to conduct a welfare check." I kept the pleasant, confused smile on my face, but internally my blood ran absolutely ice cold. Adult Protective Services. Brittany had not wasted a single minute. She had driven away from my house with pictures of my fake bank account, and the very next thing she did was weaponize the government against me. It was a classic, ruthless tactic. Make an anonymous call, claim the old man is losing his mind, have the state step in and do the dirty work of declaring him unfit. An anonymous call, I repeated softly, raising an eyebrow. "Well, I certainly do not want you to get in trouble with your bosses, Valerie. Please come on inside." I stepped aside and swung the heavy wooden door wide open. I did not act angry, I did not raise my voice or act defensive. I knew exactly how this game was played. If an elderly black man starts yelling at a government worker on his front porch, it immediately goes into a file as aggressive and erratic behavior. I was not going to give Brittany the satisfaction of a single negative footnote in my record. Valerie stepped into my foyer, her eyes instantly darting around the space. She was looking for something specific. I knew exactly what the anonymous tip had claimed. "Mr. Jenkins?" She began, looking slightly confused by what she was seeing. "The caller reported that you were living in extreme squalor. They said there was garbage piled up to the ceiling, that the house smelled of rotting food, and that you were showing severe signs of dementia. They claimed you were leaving the gas stove on and wandering the streets in the middle of the night." I let out a soft, genuine chuckle. "Well, Valerie, you are standing in my living room. Do you see any garbage?" She looked around the immaculate space. The hardwood floors were freshly polished. The antique furniture was dusted. The morning sunlight streamed through perfectly clean windows. The only smell in the air was the aroma of fresh coffee and the faint scent of lemon cleaner. "No, sir," she admitted, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "Your home is lovely. but I still need to follow protocol. Do you mind if I check the kitchen and the bathrooms? Be my guest, I said, gesturing down the hallway. I followed her into the kitchen. I walked over to my stainless steel refrigerator and pulled the door wide open. It was fully stocked. There were fresh vegetables, lean proteins, and Tupperware containers neatly labeled with dates. I offered her a bottle of cold spring water. She politely declined, a deep blush of embarrassment starting to creep up her neck. She took out a pen and flipped open her binder. I am sorry to ask these questions, Mr. Jenkins, but I have to do a basic cognitive assessment. Can you tell me what year it is, who the president is, and what you had for breakfast this morning? I answered her questions perfectly without a second of hesitation. Then I walked over to the kitchen counter and pulled open the top drawer. You know, Valerie, I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and reasonable. I think I can save you a lot of paperwork. I had a feeling that a certain family member might try to pull a stunt like this. Some people get very impatient when they think an old man is living too long and taking up space. I pulled out a thick sealed envelope with the logo of Emory University Hospital printed in the corner. I handed it to her. She opened the envelope and pulled out the crisp white documents inside. Her eyes scanned the pages rapidly. It was a comprehensive neurological and psychiatric evaluation. I had gone to the top cognitive specialist in the entire state of Georgia exactly 5 days ago. I knew Andre and Brittany were desperate, and desperate people always try to attack your mind when they want your money. Valerie read the conclusion of the report out loud, her voice filled with absolute shock. Patient exhibits 0 signs of dementia or cognitive impairment. Memory function is perfect. Patient scored 100 out of 100 on the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. Patient is completely capable of managing all personal, medical, and financial affairs independently. She lowered the paper and looked at me. The professional mask was completely gone, replaced by genuine anger on my behalf. Mr. Jenkins, I am so incredibly sorry. It is clear that someone has made a malicious and completely false report against you. We see this sometimes when family members want to force an elderly relative into a care facility to gain access to their estate. It is a criminal waste of state resources. I nodded slowly, letting out a heavy sigh to play the part of a heartbroken father. I suppose money makes people do terrible things to the people who love them. Valerie closed her binder and snapped her pen shut. I am going to close this case immediately. I will state in my official report that the allegations were entirely unfounded, and that you are in excellent physical and mental health. The person who made this call will not be able to use adult protective services against you ever again. Thank you, Valerie. I appreciate your professionalism, I said, walking her toward the front door. As she stepped out onto the porch, she paused. She looked around to make sure the street was quiet, then turned back to me, lowering her voice to a serious whisper. Mr. Jenkins, I am not really supposed to share details about an anonymous intake call, but the woman who called last night was extremely aggressive, and before she hung up the phone, she asked the operator a very specific question. I narrowed my eyes. What did she ask? She asked about the legal requirements for filing an emergency guardianship order, Valerie warned. She wanted to know exactly how fast a judge could freeze an elderly person's bank accounts and transfer total control to their next of kin if they were deemed a danger to themselves. Please, sir, be very careful. Whoever this woman is, she is not just trying to put you in a home. She is actively trying to strip you of your legal human rights. I thanked her again and watched her walk down my driveway to her car. I waited until her vehicle disappeared around the corner before I slowly closed the heavy front door. I turned the deadbolt. The gentle, misunderstood old man vanished. My jaw tightened and a cold fury burned in the pit of my stomach. Emergency guardianship. They did not just want to steal the $30,000 they thought I had. They wanted to go to a judge and have me declared legally incompetent. They wanted to take away my freedom, my voice, and my right to make decisions for myself. They wanted to bury me alive in a nursing home so they could comfortably spend my money while I stared at a blank wall until I died. I walked back into my home office and picked up the phone. A dark, terrifying smirk spread across my face. They want to play the legal game. Fine. I will show them exactly how the law works. My daughter-in-law ran a luxury fashion boutique in one of the most expensive retail districts in Atlanta. She called it her passion project. I called it exactly what it was, a massive financial black hole designed to stroke her fragile ego. She sold imported handbags and overpriced silk scarves to wealthy housewives who only bought things so they could brag about how much they spent. The boutique had never turned a profit, not even once in 4 years. Andre covered the enormous monthly losses with money he siphoned from his technology company, money that ultimately came from my anonymous venture capital firm. I was essentially funding my own disrespect. But the most amusing part of Brittany's little vanity project was her landlord. The boutique was located on the ground floor of a beautifully restored commercial building. She paid her exorbitant rent to a faceless corporate entity called Vanguard Group. She liked to boast to her friends that Vanguard was a massive international conglomerate that only leased to top-tier brands. She had absolutely no idea that Vanguard Group consisted of exactly two people, me and my lead corporate attorney. I owned the building. I owned the entire block. It was time to remind her who actually held the keys to her perfect life. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a private courier walked through the glass doors of her boutique. He handed Brittany a heavy wax-sealed envelope directly from the Vanguard Group management office. Because I owned the property outright, and because my lawyers had drafted an ironclad commercial lease with a very specific market adjustment clause, I had the legal right to change the terms under certain financial conditions. I sat at my mahogany desk at home, staring at my computer monitor. Because my anonymous firm held majority ownership of Andre's tech company, I legally owned all of his corporate communication networks. I had my IT security team route his office phone calls to a secure encrypted server. I put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones, leaned back in my leather chair, and waited. It did not take long. Less than 10 minutes after the courier dropped off the envelope, the audio feed on my screen spiked. Andre's corporate phone was ringing. "Andre, what is going on?" Brittany screamed into the receiver the second he answered. Her voice was shrill, completely stripped of its usual manufactured elegance. She sounded like a cornered animal. "Brittany, I am in the middle of a massive crisis here." Andre shot back, his voice trembling with panic. "The banks are still freezing our accounts. I have investors threatening to sue me. I cannot deal with you right now. You are going to deal with me right now," she shrieked, the sound piercing through my headphones. "Vanguard Group just served me with a legal notice. They are raising my rent by 400% effective immediately. If I do not pay the adjusted balance and sign the new lease by the end of the week, they are executing an emergency eviction." 7 days, Andre. They are going to throw my inventory out onto the street in 7 days. There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the line. I could hear Andre's rapid, shallow breathing. "I do not have the money, Brittany," he finally whispered, his voice cracking. "I do not have a single dime. The company is completely out of cash. The anonymous fund dropped us. We are ruined." Brittany let out a sound of pure rage. "I do not care about your stupid company," she yelled. "My entire social circle shops at this boutique. If I get evicted, I will be the laughingstock of Atlanta. You promised me this lifestyle, Andre. You promised me I would never have to worry about money. You are a man. Fix it." I listened to my son shrink under the weight of her toxic entitlement. He did not tell her to calm down. He did not tell her that a boutique was meaningless compared to a collapsing company. He just absorbed her abuse. "We need fast cash," Brittany said, her voice dropping to a harsh, calculating whisper. "That $30,000 in your father's savings account is not going to cut it anymore. That will not even cover my new security deposit, let alone your payroll. We need real money, hundreds of thousands, and we need it tonight." "How?" Andre pleaded. "No bank is going to touch us right now. Our credit is maxed out. We do not use a bank," Brittany replied coldly. "You still know those guys from your poker days, right? The hard money lenders, the ones operating in the shadows. They can authorize $250,000 in cash by tomorrow morning." "Brittany, those are loan sharks," Andre said, genuine terror in his voice. "They do not mess around. If we miss a payment, they will break my legs, and they require massive collateral up front. We do not own the penthouse. We do not own the cars. What are we going to use for collateral?" "Your father's house," she said without a second of hesitation. I closed my eyes. The temperature in my home office seemed to drop 10 degrees. I sat perfectly still in the darkness, letting the gravity of her words wash over me. "That house is located in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood." Brittany continued, her tone completely devoid of human empathy. "It is fully paid off. It is easily worth $500,000 in this market. The hard money lenders do not run background checks. They just need the physical property deed and a signed transfer agreement to hold as a guarantee." "Brittany, I cannot do that," Andre whispered. "He is my father. If we default on a loan with those guys, they will literally come and take his house. They will throw him out onto the street. He will be homeless. He is going to a nursing home anyway," she snapped back viciously. "Have you forgotten our plan? We are filing the emergency guardianship papers next week. Once the state declares him mentally incompetent, we get control of the house anyway. We are just speeding up the timeline. Get the deed, Andre. You told me he keeps all his important documents in the bottom drawer of his desk. He sleeps like a rock. You can get in, take the deed, and be out before he even rolls over." I waited for the refusal. I waited for the son I raised, the boy I taught to be honorable and strong, to finally draw the line. I prayed silently to a God I hoped was listening, that Andre would tell his wife that robbing his elderly father in the middle of the night was a line he would never cross. "Just get it done, Andre," she commanded. "If you do not save my store, I am taking Leo and I am leaving you. I will not be married to a broke failure." "Okay," Andre finally whispered. His voice was hollow, defeated, and utterly pathetic. "Okay, I still have my spare key. I will go over there tonight after he goes to sleep. I will get the deed." The call disconnected. I slowly reached up and took off my headphones. The silence in my office was deafening. There was no more sadness left in my heart. There was no more disappointment. The final shred of paternal leniency had just been completely eradicated. My son had just agreed to steal the home that his mother and I built with our bare hands. He had agreed to hand over my sanctuary to violent criminals, just to appease a woman who despised me. I stood up and walked over to my filing cabinet. I unlocked it and pulled out the original authentic deed to my house. I placed it securely in a hidden wall safe behind a painting. Then I went to my desk and opened the bottom drawer. I placed a highly realistic copy of the deed inside a thick manila envelope. To the untrained eye, it looked perfectly legitimate. It even had a convincing notary stamp. But legally, it was absolutely worthless. It was a piece of paper that would give Andre enough confidence to borrow money from very dangerous men, money he would never be able to pay back. He was going to hand a fake deed to a crime syndicate, and when they realized the paper was worthless, they were not going to come looking for me. They were going to come looking for the man who signed the fraudulent contract. I turned off all the lights in my house. I made sure the front door was locked, leaving only the deadbolt disengaged so the spare key would work. I walked back into my home office and sat in the pitch-black darkness. I picked up my digital tablet and opened the security application. The screen glowed softly, illuminating my face in the shadows. I switched the camera feed to the front porch and activated the infrared night vision. The world on the screen turned into a sharp, ghostly black and white image. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. 11 o'clock. Midnight. 1 in the morning. I did not move a single muscle. I just sat there waiting in the dark like a predator in the brush. At exactly 1:45 in the morning, a shadow moved across the infrared camera. A figure stepped onto my front porch. He was wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over his head, trying to hide his face. But I knew the shape of his shoulders. I knew the way he stood. It was Andre. I watched him reach into his pocket and pull out the shiny brass spare key I had given him years ago for emergencies. He inserted the key into the lock. I heard the faint metallic click echo through the silent house. The front door slowly began to open. My son was stepping into my home like a thief in the night. He had chosen his path. Now it was time for him to walk it all the way to the end. The faint creak of the front door hinges sounded like a gunshot in the dead of night. I sat perfectly still in the pitch black of my home office, watching the infrared camera feed on my digital tablet. The glowing white figure of my son slipped through the entryway. He closed the door behind him with agonizing slowness, wincing at the tiny click of the latch. It was the exact same way he used to sneak into the house when he was a teenager coming home past his curfew. Back then, I used to wait up for him in my recliner, ready to give him a stern lecture about responsibility. Tonight, I was waiting in the shadows to watch him commit a felony. He stood in the foyer for a long moment, listening to the silence of the house. I had purposefully left my bedroom door slightly ajar and placed a small, steady white noise machine near my bed to mimic the sound of a deep, uninterrupted sleep. I watched him pull down his hood. His face was pale slick with a cold sweat. He looked terrified, but not terrified enough to turn around and walk out. Andre began to move down the hallway. He knew exactly where to step to avoid the creaky floorboards. I had taught him that when we used to try not to wake his mother on Sunday mornings. My heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. A part of me, the foolish, sentimental part of a father, was still hoping he would stop. I watched the screen, silently begging him to turn around. Just walk away, Andre, I thought. Just walk out that door, call me tomorrow, confess your debts, and ask me for help like a man. If you do that, I will save you. But he did not stop. He walked right past my bedroom door without even a glance inside to check on me. His destination was not the father he was about to destroy. His destination was my mahogany desk. I slipped out of my chair and moved soundlessly into the small closet attached to my office. I left the closet door open just a crack, giving me a direct line of sight to the desk. I held my tablet in one hand and aimed my smartphone camera through the gap with the other, ensuring the recording indicator was covered with a piece of black tape. Andre crept into the office. The moonlight filtering through the window blinds cast long skeletal shadows across the floor. He moved quickly now, driven by the frantic energy of a desperate man. He went straight to the heavy mahogany desk. He grabbed the handle of the bottom drawer and pulled. It did not budge. I had locked it, of course. Making it too easy would have made him suspicious. A thief needs to feel like he has earned his prize. He let out a frustrated breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a flat metal pry bar. He jammed the metal edge into the gap above the drawer lock. I watched my son, a man who wore $4,000 suits and called himself a tech visionary, grunting and straining to break into a piece of furniture I had bought 30 years ago. The wood splintered with a sharp crack. The lock gave way. Andre yanked the drawer open. He frantically dug through old plumbing invoices, tax returns, and utility bills. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped several papers onto the floor, and then his fingers brushed against the thick manila envelope I had planted right in the center. He pulled it out. He opened the flap and slid the document halfway out into the dim moonlight. I could see the bold, official-looking text of the fake property deed. I saw his shoulders drop as a massive wave of relief washed over him. He had it. He thought he held the keys to his salvation, the collateral that would buy him $250,000 from dangerous men in the shadows. He had no idea he was holding a worthless piece of paper that would soon become his one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. Andre quickly folded the envelope and shoved it deep into the inside pocket of his hoodie. He let out a long, shaky breath. He had done it. He had crossed the point of no return. Then he reached into his pants pocket and pulled out his cell phone. The glowing screen illuminated his face. He dialed a number and pressed the phone to his ear. I raised my own phone, making sure the video was capturing his face clearly, and turned up the directional microphone attachment I had connected to my device. The audio fed directly into my earpiece with crystal-clear precision. "Brittany," he whispered, his voice trembling but laced with a dark, triumphant excitement. I could hear her shrill voice bleeding through his phone speaker. "Did you get it?" she demanded, not asking if he was safe, not asking if he had been caught. "I got it," Andre whispered back, patting the envelope inside his jacket. It was right where I knew it would be. The old man is sleeping like a log. He did not hear a single thing. I am looking at the deed right now. It is completely clean. No liens, no mortgages. Thank God, Brittany sighed, her voice dripping with venomous relief. "Now listen to me. You call the brokers as soon as the sun comes up. Tell them we have the collateral and we need the cash wired by noon to save the boutique. Do not let them negotiate the interest rate. Just take the money." I know. Andre whispered, looking nervously toward the office door. "I will handle the loan sharks." "But what are we going to do about him? What happens when he wakes up and realizes his desk has been pried open and the deed is gone?" Brittany let out a cold, sharp laugh that made my stomach turn. "Who cares what he thinks?" she sneered. "We are accelerating the timeline. The moment you secure that cash tomorrow, we execute the plan. I already talked to that private doctor you paid off. He has the paperwork ready to go. Tomorrow afternoon, we call the emergency psychiatric transport. We tell them he is having a violent delusion that he broke his own desk and thinks someone stole from him. It is the perfect narrative." Andre hesitated for a fraction of a second. "The lowest level psych ward, Brittany. The state-run facility. You know how horrible those places are. They will drug him into a stupor within 24 hours. "That is exactly the point, Andre," she snapped, her voice devoid of any human empathy. "Tomorrow, after we pawn this deed, we will throw him into the lowest level psych ward in the county. By the time anyone tries to investigate his claims about stolen property, he will be so heavily medicated he will not even remember his own name. Then the court grants us emergency guardianship, and the house legally becomes ours anyway to cover the loan. We win, he loses, end of story. Now get out of there before you wake him up." Andre nodded in the dark, his face hardening. "You are right. This is for our survival. I will see you at home." He hung up the phone. He took one last look around my office, a space he had spent hundreds of hours in as a child learning how to read, watching me draft plumbing estimates. He looked at the splintered wood of the drawer he had just destroyed. He did not show a single ounce of remorse. He just turned on his heel and crept out of the room. I stayed perfectly still in the closet, watching through the crack in the door as his glowing white figure moved across my tablet screen. I watched him navigate the hallway, open the front door with absolute precision, and slip out into the night. The faint click of the deadbolt locking behind him echoed in the silent house. I waited 5 full minutes. I listened to the sound of his electric car rolling away down the street until there was nothing but the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then I pushed the closet door open and stepped out into my office. I walked over to the desk. I ran my calloused fingers over the splintered wood of the broken drawer. I felt the rough, jagged edges of the betrayal, my own flesh and blood, a son who was perfectly willing to drug me into a chemical coma and lock me in a state-run asylum just so he could maintain a lifestyle built on lies. I looked down at my phone. The video recording was flawless. The moonlight had captured his face perfectly as he admitted to stealing the document. The directional microphone had picked up every single word of his conversation with Brittany, detailing their conspiracy to commit fraud, their plan to use loan sharks, and their premeditated intention to falsely imprison an elderly man in a psychiatric facility. It was a masterpiece of self-incrimination. I stopped the recording and saved the file to multiple secure cloud servers. The sadness that had been lingering in the back of my mind completely evaporated. It was burned away by a cold, calculating resolve. They thought they were playing a game of chess with a senile pawn. They had no idea they had just walked onto a board controlled by a grandmaster who owned every single square. I opened my encrypted messaging application and attached the video file. I selected the contact for Dr. Graham Montgomery, my lead attorney, and the only man outside of myself who knew the true extent of my wealth and power. I typed a very short, precise message to accompany the video of my son's ultimate betrayal. They took the bait. They plan to execute the fake psychiatric hold tomorrow afternoon. Prepare the net. We end this. I hit send. I watched the progress bar quickly shoot across the screen until the message was delivered. I set the phone down on the desk. I did not go back to sleep. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the lights, and brewed another pot of strong black coffee. I had a lot of work to do before the sun came up. Tomorrow was going to be the most important day of my life. Tomorrow my son and his toxic wife were going to learn that when you try to bury an innocent man alive, you better make absolutely sure he does not own the shovel. The heavy oak clock in my hallway ticked with a slow, rhythmic precision. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I sat in my worn fabric recliner wearing an oversized, faded gray cardigan that swallowed my shoulders, making me look frail and diminished. I had spent the entire morning preparing my stage. I had not shaved. I had intentionally rubbed a small amount of ash from the fireplace onto the cuffs of my trousers to look neglected. I was no longer the sharp, calculating architect of a massive real estate empire. I was exactly what my son and his toxic wife desperately needed me to be. A confused, deteriorating old man whose mind was slowly slipping into the dark. I heard the sound of a heavy vehicle pulling into my driveway, followed by the slamming of car doors. Footsteps approached my porch. The front door swung open without a knock. Andre walked in, using the spare key he had used to rob me just hours prior. He was not alone. Behind my son stood a man who looked like he had crawled out of a cheap legal drama. He wore a poorly fitted white medical coat over a shiny, inexpensive suit. His hair was slicked back with too much gel, and the faint, sour smell of stale tobacco and cheap mint cologne followed him into my living room. He carried a battered black leather briefcase. This was the man Andre and Brittany had purchased. This was the corrupt doctor they had hired to steal my freedom. Dad, Andre said, pitching his voice loud and slow, the exact way ignorant people speak to the deaf or the mentally impaired. I brought someone to see you. This is Dr. Vance. He is a private specialist. We just want to do a little checkup to make sure you are doing okay. I looked up at them, keeping my chin lowered against my chest. I widened my eyes, forcing a look of absolute childlike bewilderment onto my face. I let my mouth hang slightly open. I did not speak immediately. I let the silence stretch, making them wait, making them believe that my brain was struggling to process a simple sentence. Who, I finally mumbled, making my voice tremble slightly. I did not ask for a doctor. I feel perfectly fine. I just want to watch my television programs. Dr. Vance stepped forward, flashing a smile that was entirely devoid of any genuine human warmth. It was the smile of a predator evaluating a highly profitable meal. Now, Mr. Jenkins, the doctor cooed, sitting down heavily on my sofa and opening his briefcase. There is nothing to be afraid of. Andre here loves you very much. He is just a concerned son. We are going to play a few simple memory games. It will be over before you know it. I looked at Andre. My own flesh and blood. He stood near the doorway with his arms crossed over his chest, watching me with a cold, detached anticipation. There was no pity in his eyes. There was no sorrow for the father he believed was losing his mind. There was only the greedy impatience of a man waiting to cash a winning lottery ticket. The assessment began. It was a humiliating, insulting charade designed not to test my cognition, but to build a fraudulent paper trail. Dr. Vance pulled a pen and a clipboard from his bag. He asked me what year it was. I stared at the coffee table for a long, agonizing moment. I squinted, pretending to search the empty corners of my mind for an answer. I slowly raised my head and looked the corrupt doctor dead in the eye. "It is 1998, I whispered softly. Andre let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Dr. Vance scribbled furiously on his clipboard, nodding with fake sympathy. "I see," the doctor murmured. "And can you tell me who the current president is, Mr. Jenkins?" I shook my head, letting a look of rising panic wash over my face. "I do not know." I stammered, my breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "Why are you asking me these questions? I just want you to leave my house." "Mr. Jenkins, please calm down," the doctor said, his tone turning sharply patronizing. "I'm going to ask you to draw something for me." He handed me a blank sheet of paper and a pen. "Draw the face of a clock," he instructed. "Put the numbers in the correct places and set the time to 10 minutes past 11. I took the pen with a violently trembling hand. I focused all my physical energy on making my fingers shake. I pressed the pen to the paper and slowly drew a jagged, distorted circle. I put the numbers entirely out of order, clustering them all on the right side of the page, and drew 2 chaotic lines that pointed nowhere. I handed the paper back to him, looking at Andre with a perfect imitation of sheer, helpless terror. Andre looked at the ruined drawing. The corner of his mouth twitched upward into a microscopic smirk. He was enjoying this. He was actively enjoying watching the man who had sacrificed everything to raise him look like a broken, pathetic shell of a human being. "Let us try one last question," Dr. Vance said, leaning forward and lowering his voice. "This is an easy one. Andre tells me you have a beautiful grandson. Can you tell me your grandson's name?" The room fell completely silent. This was the ultimate test. Little Leo, the beautiful, innocent baby boy whose baptism I had been turned away from just yesterday. I stared at the corrupt doctor. I opened my mouth, then closed it. I looked over at Andre, extending my trembling hand toward him as if begging for a lifeline. "A grandson," I whispered, letting a single calculated tear roll down my weathered cheek. "I do not have a grandson. Andre is just a little boy. He is at school." Andre let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "That is enough, doctor," he said, his voice dripping with manufactured grief. "You have seen enough." It is breaking my heart to watch him like this. Dr. Vance sighed heavily, snapping his clipboard shut. "I am incredibly sorry, Andre. The cognitive decline is severe and undeniably rapid. He is a danger to himself. He cannot be left alone in this house for another night." The doctor reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of crisp, pre-printed medical forms. He did not hesitate. He did not perform a single actual medical diagnostic. He uncapped his gold fountain pen and began signing his name across the bottom of the pages. "Based on my professional medical evaluation, I am officially diagnosing your father with stage 3 Alzheimer's disease," the doctor declared, stamping the papers with his official medical seal. "This certificate of incompetence is legally binding. You can take this directly to the probate judge this afternoon to secure your emergency financial and medical guardianship." Andre reached out and took the papers. His hands were practically shaking with greed. "Thank you, doctor," he said. "You have no idea how much this helps our family." Dr. Vance stood up, adjusting his cheap suit. He looked at Andre, and in a moment of pure, unfiltered arrogance, the doctor gave my son a slow, deliberate wink. It was the universal gesture of thieves completing a dirty transaction. "Let us step out into the hallway to discuss the final arrangements," Andre said, gesturing toward the front door. They walked out of the living room, leaving me alone in my armchair. The moment they were out of sight, the trembling in my hands stopped instantly. The confused, frightened look vanished from my face, replaced by a mask of cold, hard stone. I sat perfectly still listening. In the hallway, their voices dropped to a hushed, conspiratorial whisper, but they were not quiet enough. "The paperwork is bulletproof," the doctor muttered. "No judge in the state will question it. Now about my compensation." "I am sending it right now," Andre whispered back. $10,000, just like we agreed. Check your secure application." There was a brief pause, followed by the distinct electronic chime of a mobile banking transfer notification. "Pleasure doing business with you, Andre." The doctor chuckled softly. "Good luck with the old man." The front door opened and closed. I heard the doctor's car engine start and drive away. Andre walked back into the living room, completely ignoring me as he stared down at the fraudulent medical certificate in his hands. He tapped away on his phone, likely sending a message to Brittany that their vile mission was accomplished. Then, without saying a single word of goodbye to the father he had just condemned to a mental prison, he turned and walked out the door, locking it behind him. I waited until I heard his electric car pull out of the driveway. Then I stood up. My posture was perfectly straight. My mind was razor sharp. I walked over to the heavy oak coffee table where the doctor had been sitting. I knelt down and reached underneath the thick wooden rim. My fingers brushed against a strip of strong duct tape. I peeled it back and pulled down a sleek black voice-activated recording pen. I had taped it there before they arrived, perfectly positioned to capture every single sound in the living room and the adjacent hallway. I clicked the small playback button. The audio was pristine. I heard my own shaky voice. I heard the doctor's fake diagnosis. And most importantly, I heard the crisp, undeniable sound of the electronic banking chime, followed by the doctor's confirmation of the $10,000 bribe. I held the recording pen in the palm of my hand, feeling the cold metal against my skin. They thought they had just secured the keys to my kingdom. They thought they had legally erased my existence, but they had just handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy their lives forever. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed my lead corporate attorney. "Graham," I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority in the empty house. The rat took the cheese. "I have the audio recording of the medical bribe, and they have the forged incompetence papers in their hands. They are heading to the bank." "Excellent, Mr. Jenkins," the lawyer replied smoothly. "The net is fully prepared." "Good," I said, slipping the recording pen into my pocket. "Let them walk into the lobby. Let them put the pen to the paper. And then we drop the hammer." The drive to downtown Atlanta took less than 20 minutes, but to me it felt like a quiet victory lap. I did not drive my rusted 1998 Ford pickup truck this time. That truck had served its purpose perfectly. It had convinced my son that I was nothing more than a broken-down old man waiting to die. Instead, my private driver picked me up in a sleek midnight black town car with heavily tinted windows. I sat in the spacious leather back seat watching the city skyline grow larger. I was no longer wearing the oversized faded cardigan from this morning. I wore a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit made of imported Italian wool. It was a suit I usually reserved for high-level board meetings in London or New York. Today I was wearing it to execute my own flesh and blood. We pulled up to the towering glass facade of the First National Bank of Atlanta. It was their flagship branch, a place of polished marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and quiet, serious money. I stepped out of the car. The heavy glass doors parted for me. I walked into the cavernous lobby. I did not limp. I did not shuffle. I walked with the heavy, measured strides of a man who owned the very concrete beneath the building. My eyes immediately scanned the room. I bypassed the long lines of everyday customers waiting for the tellers. I looked toward the back of the bank where the private glass-walled offices were reserved for branch managers and high-net-worth clients. And there he was. Andre was sitting comfortably in a plush leather guest chair inside the office of the senior branch manager, a man named Mr. Sterling. Andre looked perfectly at ease. He was wearing his expensive navy blue suit, his legs crossed casually at the ankle. He was leaning forward, projecting the image of a deeply concerned, responsible son, taking charge of a family tragedy. From where I stood in the lobby, I could see the thick manila envelope sitting on the edge of the manager's mahogany desk. Inside that envelope was the fake property deed he had stolen from my home office, along with the fraudulent medical certificate he had purchased just 2 hours ago. I walked slowly toward the glass office. I wanted to savor every single second of this moment. I stopped just outside the heavy glass door. It was cracked open an inch or two, allowing me to hear their conversation perfectly. "It is just heartbreaking, Mr. Sterling," Andre was saying, pitching his voice with a manufactured sadness that made my stomach turn. "My father has declined so rapidly. The doctors say it is advanced stage Alzheimer's. He does not even know his own name half the time. He wanders around the house breaking furniture. He is a complete danger to himself. I am stepping in as his emergency financial guardian to make sure his medical care is fully funded. Mr. Sterling nodded sympathetically, adjusting his silver-framed glasses as he looked over the forged documents. I am so incredibly sorry to hear that, Andre, the manager said softly. It is a terrible disease. This medical certificate from Dr. Vance is perfectly in order. And you are looking to secure a home equity line of credit against his property using this deed, as well as transfer the $34,000 from his standard savings account into a trust under your name. That is correct, Andre replied smoothly, not missing a single beat. We need the liquid cash immediately to secure his spot in a specialized psychiatric care facility. They require a massive deposit up front. I just want my father to be safe and comfortable in his final years. The sheer audacity of his lies was breathtaking. He was sitting in a bank attempting to steal my life savings and mortgage the home I built with his mother, all while claiming it was an act of profound love. He was going to take that money, pay off his violent loan shark, save his wife's failing boutique, and then drop me into a state-run mental asylum to rot. Mr. Sterling began typing rapidly on his keyboard. Let me just prepare the final authorization forms, Andre. I just need you to sign on the bottom line of the transfer agreement, and the funds will be available in your account within the hour. The manager printed the documents. The printer whirred and spit out the crisp white pages that would legally seal my financial doom. Mr. Sterling slid the papers across the polished mahogany desk. He unclipped a heavy gold pen from his shirt pocket and handed it to my son. Andre took the pen. His fingers were completely steady. There was no hesitation. There was no moral conflict. He lowered the tip of the gold pen toward the signature line. I pushed the heavy glass door open. It swung inward with a quiet, heavy swoosh. I would not sign that if I were you, I said. My voice was low, deep, and echoed off the glass walls of the small office. Andre froze. The tip of the pen stopped a fraction of an inch above the paper. He slowly turned his head. When his eyes landed on me, all the color instantly drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost rise from the grave. He looked at my posture. He looked at my pristine, custom-tailored suit. He looked at the absolute chilling calmness in my eyes. The fragile, confused old man he had left in the living room 2 hours ago was completely gone. Dad, Andre choked out, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wheeze. What are you doing here? You are supposed to be at home. You are sick. I ignored him completely. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I walked straight past my trembling son and approached the branch manager's desk. Mr. Sterling looked up at me, clearly confused by the sudden intrusion. Excuse me, sir, the manager said, his tone polite but firm. This is a private meeting. Andre here is conducting emergency family business. You cannot be in here. I did not say a word. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a sleek, heavy, matte black metal card. It was not a standard credit card. It was a J.P. Morgan Reserve card, an invitation-only financial instrument issued exclusively to clients with liquid assets exceeding $10 million at their institution. I placed the heavy metal card gently onto the center of his mahogany desk. It landed with a solid, authoritative thud right on top of the fraudulent medical documents my son had brought. Mr. Sterling looked down at the card, annoyed at first. Then his eyes focused on the engraved silver letters. He saw my name, Tyrone Jenkins. Then his eyes darted to the corporate entity listed directly beneath it, Vanguard Holdings Group. I watched the exact moment the branch manager realized who was standing in his office. Vanguard Holdings Group was not just a client. It was the single largest commercial real estate holding company in the entire southeastern district of the bank. We held hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate accounts directly within his branch. I was the ghost chairman his regional directors had been desperately trying to invite to dinner for the past decade. Mr. Sterling began to shake. A sheen of nervous sweat broke out across his forehead. His breathing hitched. He pushed his chair back so fast it slammed into the wall behind him. He stood up immediately, his hands trembling as he scrambled to button his suit jacket. He bypassed the desk entirely and bowed his head with an expression of absolute terrified reverence. Mr. Jenkins, the branch manager stammered, his voice breathless and completely panicked. Sir, I had absolutely no idea. It is a profound honor to finally meet you in person. Please, sir, take my chair. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? I am so incredibly sorry for not recognizing you. The air in the glass office became suffocatingly thick. Mr. Sterling did not hesitate for a single second. He immediately reached for his desk phone, his fingers flying across the keypad to lock down the entire banking system. He did not look at Andre with sympathy anymore. He looked at him like a toxic liability that had almost cost him his entire career. Andre remained frozen in his guest chair. His mouth was hanging wide open. His eyes darted frantically from the terrified branch manager to the heavy black card on the desk and finally up to my face. The illusion of his entire life was fracturing into a million irreparable pieces right in front of him. "Mr. Sterling," I said softly, keeping my eyes locked on my son, "I believe the man sitting in your chair is attempting to commit federal bank fraud using forged medical documents. Please freeze all transactions immediately and call your corporate security division." Andre dropped the gold pen. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. He tried to stand up, his legs shaking so badly he had to grip the armrests of his chair just to keep from collapsing. "Dad," he pleaded, the arrogance entirely stripped from his soul. "Dad, please. This is a mistake. I can explain everything. I was just trying to protect you." "You were trying to protect your lifestyle," I corrected him, my voice slicing through the room like a surgical blade. "You stole a fake deed from my desk. You paid a corrupt doctor $10,000 to declare me insane. You came here to steal my last imaginary pennies to pay off loan sharks. You never wanted to protect me. You wanted to erase me." Mr. Sterling spoke rapidly into his phone, demanding that bank security and local law enforcement be dispatched to his office immediately. The walls were closing in on Andre. He looked toward the glass door, realizing that there was no way out. The corporate security guards were already marching purposefully across the marble lobby, their eyes locked directly on the manager's office. Andre sank back down into the leather chair. The realization of his absolute ruin washed over his face. He had brought a fake medical certificate to a bank owned by the very man he was trying to commit. He had walked willingly into the jaws of a trap that had been set with surgical precision. "Damn it," Andre whispered, burying his face in his trembling hands as the reality of his impending destruction finally crushed him. "You are just a plumber." I stood tall, feeling the weight of the past 40 years of sacrifice lift completely from my shoulders. I adjusted my cuffs, staring down at the son who had tried to bury me alive. "I was a plumber, Andre," I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality as the security guards opened the glass door. "Now, I am the man who owns the bank that is about to send you to federal prison." The corporate security guards at the bank had detained Andre long enough for the federal authorities to begin building their massive fraud case against him. Because the criminal investigation was still under a strict gag order to catch the loan sharks and the forged document ring, Andre was temporarily released into the custody of his own mounting terror. But the damage was already done. The bank had permanently locked his mortgage application. They froze his checking accounts. They flagged his social security number across every major financial institution in the country. He was completely and utterly paralyzed. I sat in my home office, sipping my dark coffee, listening to the intercepted phone calls between my son and his wife. The panic in their voices was absolute music to my ears. The violent men from the underground lending syndicate were giving them exactly 48 hours to produce the $250,000 they had promised. Brittany was weeping hysterically. Her luxury boutique was 3 days away from a public eviction. Their world was entirely up in flames. But true narcissists never surrender to reality. They simply try to build a bigger, more elaborate lie. Instead of packing their bags and fleeing the city, Brittany decided to double down on her manufactured high society image. I listened in pure disbelief as she pitched her brilliant survival strategy to a weeping Andre. She was going to host an emergency fundraising gala. She booked the grand ballroom at the most expensive 5-star hotel in downtown Atlanta, paying the deposit with the absolute last remaining limit on a high-interest credit card she had hidden from her husband. Her plan was as arrogant as it was criminal. She was going to invite the entirety of her wealthy elite social circle. The old money families, the corporate investors, the city council members who had attended my grandson's baptism. She was going to dress Andre up in his finest tuxedo and have him pitch a completely fabricated expansion of his technology firm. She wanted to scam her own friends, hoping to secure enough fraudulent seed money in a single night to pay off the loan shark, save her boutique, and run away. It was a spectacular display of absolute moral bankruptcy. I picked up my secure phone and called my lead attorney, Graham Montgomery. I told him about Brittany's desperate little gala. I gave him one simple instruction: make absolutely sure I receive an invitation. 2 days later, a thick, cream-colored envelope with gold-embossed lettering arrived in my mailbox. The return address belonged to my daughter-in-law. It was an exclusive invitation to the Future of Technology Investment Gala. I ran my calloused thumb over the expensive paper. Brittany had no idea that her anonymous legal team, the ones who supposedly helped her secure the ballroom, were actually on my payroll. She had no idea she had just invited the architect of her own destruction to the front row of her final performance. I walked into my bedroom and looked at the faded brown suit hanging on the back of my chair, the suit I wore to the church, the suit that made my daughter-in-law call me a filthy old man. I picked it up, walked out to the backyard, and dropped it directly into the trash bin. That man did not exist anymore. It was time to dress for the funeral of their empire. I made a phone call to a private appointment-only tailor in the exclusive Buckhead district. This was a man who crafted suits for international diplomats visiting royalty and billionaire executives. I did not ask for a fitting next week. I told him I needed a masterpiece in 48 hours and I was willing to pay whatever premium he required. When I walked into his luxurious cedar-lined studio, the tailor did not look at my rough hands or my simple clothes. He looked at my posture, my absolute authority, and the heavy black metal bank card I placed on his cutting table. I want a bespoke suit, I told him, my voice calm and commanding. I want it tailored from the finest midnight blue Italian wool you have in your vault. I want the cut to be aggressive but deeply elegant. I want a silk lining hand-stitched lapels and a crisp white French cuff shirt. I want a suit that tells everyone in the room that I own the building before I even open my mouth. The tailor nodded silently, a look of profound respect on his face. He brought out his measuring tapes and went to work. For 2 days, his entire team worked around the clock. When I returned for the final fitting, the price tag was $15,000. I swiped my card without blinking. I stood in front of the three-way mirror in the tailor shop. I looked at the reflection staring back at me. The tired, hunched plumber was completely gone. In his place stood a 74-year-old titan of industry, the midnight blue wool draped over my shoulders with immaculate precision. The white cuffs peeked out perfectly from the sleeves fastened with solid gold cufflinks. My silver hair was neatly trimmed, my beard freshly lined. I looked like a man who could destroy a corporation with a single phone call. I looked like a king. The evening of the gala arrived. The air in downtown Atlanta was crisp and cool. The streets surrounding the five-star hotel were lined with luxury vehicles. Valets were running back and forth, opening doors for the city's most elite citizens. Women in sparkling evening gowns and men in sharp tuxedos were walking up the red-carpeted steps, completely unaware that they were walking into a massive financial trap set by a desperate woman. Inside the grand ballroom, I knew Brittany and Andre were putting on the performance of a lifetime. They were probably smiling, shaking hands, and pouring expensive champagne, desperately trying to project an aura of immense success, while their entire reality crumbled beneath their feet. They thought they were the smartest people in the room. They thought they had outsmarted the loan sharks, outsmarted the banks, and outsmarted the pathetic old man they had tried to lock in a psychiatric ward. They were so incredibly wrong. I did not drive myself to the hotel. I sat in the spacious, leather-lined back seat of a gleaming, midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom. I had instructed my private driver to take the long way around the block, waiting for the perfect moment to make my entrance. I wanted the courtyard to be packed with people. I wanted maximum visibility. "Take us in," I told the driver, checking the gold watch on my wrist. "It is time." The massive, silent engine of the Rolls-Royce glided smoothly up the sweeping driveway of the hotel. It bypassed the line of waiting vehicles, pulling right up to the front entrance with an undeniable sense of authority. The chatter among the wealthy guests standing on the steps slowly died down. Everyone turned to look at the majestic vehicle, wondering which foreign dignitary or billionaire investor had just arrived. The hotel valet rushed forward, his white gloves gleaming under the crystal chandeliers of the portico. He reached out and pulled open the heavy rear door of the Phantom. I stepped out into the cool evening air. I planted my polished leather shoes firmly on the red carpet. I stood up to my full height, buttoning the center button of my $15,000 bespoke suit. I rolled my shoulders back and looked up at the towering glass doors of the hotel. The guests on the steps parted like the Red Sea. They stared at me with absolute awe and quiet respect. No one saw a filthy old man. No one saw a tired plumber. They saw absolute, unyielding power. I took a slow, deep breath, a cold smile forming on my lips. The stage was perfectly set. The audience was in their seats. It was time for the main event. Let the show begin. The red carpet felt soft beneath my polished leather shoes, but my steps were as heavy and unstoppable as iron. I walked through the towering glass doors of the Grand Hotel, leaving the cool night air behind me. Inside the lobby was a dazzling display of crystal chandeliers and imported marble floors. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the low hum of classical music playing from a string quartet in the corner. I moved with a slow and deliberate pace. Every single movement was calculated. I was no longer the tired plumber who had stood on the church steps just a few days ago. I was the architect of my own empire, stepping into the blinding light for the very first time. I approached the grand ballroom where my son and his toxic wife were hosting their fraudulent fundraising gala. The massive mahogany doors were propped wide open. Inside the room was a sea of glittering evening gowns and sharp tuxedos. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated seamlessly with silver trays of champagne. I stood at the threshold and looked out over the crowd. These were the city elite, the people who thought they ruled the world. But I knew the absolute truth. I owned the concrete they were standing on. I took a deep breath, adjusted the cuffs of my bespoke midnight blue suit, and stepped into the ballroom. It did not happen all at once. The silence rippled through the room like a wave crashing against the shore. First, the people nearest to the entrance stopped talking. They turned to look at the man who commanded such an undeniable heavy presence. Then the silence began to spread rapidly. The clinking of glasses ceased. The quiet, polite laughter died away entirely. Within mere moments, the entire ballroom fell completely and utterly silent. Hundreds of eyes were locked directly on me. I kept my face entirely impassive. I walked slowly down the center aisle, the crowd parting before me like water fleeing from a stone. At the far end of the room, standing beneath a massive floral arrangement, was my daughter-in-law. Brittany was wearing a stunning emerald green gown, holding a crystal flute of champagne and flashing her manufactured smile at a group of wealthy, unsuspecting investors. She was fully in her element, playing the role of the successful tech visionary wife trying to save her noble husband. But then the unnatural silence of the room caught her attention. She turned her head, her blonde hair catching the chandelier light. She looked down the center aisle and saw me. Even from 50 feet away, I could see the exact moment her brain struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. She recognized my face, the face of the filthy old man she had humiliated and tried to lock away. But she could not comprehend the $15,000 suit, the immaculate grooming, or the absolute authority radiating from my every step. For a fleeting second, she looked utterly confused. Then the confusion morphed into pure, unadulterated panic. She thought I was a hallucination. Then she thought I had spent my last imaginary pennies to rent a suit and crash her party. She thought I was here to embarrass her, to ruin her desperate scam in front of the only people whose opinions mattered to her shallow existence. Her face twisted into that familiar mask of ugly contempt. She excused herself from the investors, her movements rigid and frantic. She marched toward me, her high heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She met me right in the center of the ballroom. The entire crowd was watching us with bated breath, sensing the heavy tension in the air. Andre was trailing a few steps behind her, his face already pale with an unspoken dread. Tyrone Brittany hissed, her voice a desperate, venomous whisper. "What in the world do you think you are doing here? How did you even get past the front door? You are trespassing." I looked down at her. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. "I am attending a gala, Brittany," I said calmly. "I received a very lovely invitation in the mail. I thought it would be rude not to show up and support my family in their time of desperate need." She let out a sharp, breathless laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. She looked around nervously, seeing the elite guests staring at us in dead silence. She stepped closer, invading my personal space, just like she had done on the church steps during the baptism. "You listen to me, you pathetic old man," she whispered viciously. "I do not know where you stole that suit, but you are not going to ruin my life. This is my night. We are about to secure millions of dollars. You are nothing but a broke plumber who belongs in a state-run asylum." She spun around and waved frantically toward the entrance. "Security," she screamed, finally losing her carefully crafted composure. Her shrill voice echoed off the high ceilings. "Security, we have a trespasser. Get in here right now. Throw this homeless old man out of my gala. I demand that you remove him immediately." 3 large men in dark suits pushed their way through the crowd. They were the hotel security team, moving with quick professional efficiency. The man leading them was the head of security, a broad-shouldered veteran I knew very well. Brittany pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. "Grab him," she ordered the security chief. "He is a delusional old man who sneaked in off the street. Throw him out into the alley where he belongs." The head of security stopped walking. He did not reach for my arms. He did not look at me with suspicion. He looked at Brittany with an expression of profound confusion and deep irritation. Then the broad-shouldered man turned his body toward me. He planted his feet together, straightened his posture, and bowed his head respectfully. "Good evening, Mr. Jenkins," the head of security said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "It is an absolute honor to have you here tonight, sir. Is there a problem with this guest?" Brittany froze. Her mouth hung open, but no words came out. She looked at the security chief, then back at me, her mind entirely failing to grasp the situation. The security chief turned back to her, his tone dropping to a cold professional warning. "Ma'am, I would strongly advise you to lower your voice and step back. You are currently yelling at Mr. Tyrone Jenkins. He is the chairman of the board of Vanguard Holdings Group. He is the sole owner of the corporation that owns this entire hotel and every single commercial building on this city block." The words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. The silence in the ballroom deepened into something entirely suffocating. I watched the reality of the situation crash into Brittany's mind like a runaway freight train. The filthy old man she had tried to lock in a psychiatric ward, the broke plumber she had planned to rob to save her failing boutique, the father she had convinced her husband to betray. He was not a victim. He was a titan. He was the undisputed owner of the very ground she was standing on. The delicate crystal champagne flute slipped from Brittany's trembling fingers. It hit the marble floor and shattered into 1,000 tiny glittering pieces. The sound of the breaking glass was loud and final, echoing the complete and utter destruction of her manufactured world. Behind her, Andre stumbled backward. He staggered as if he had been physically struck in the chest. I looked at my son. His jaw was slack. His eyes were wide with a terror so absolute it looked like it was stopping his heart. His face was completely drained of blood, leaving him as pale as a ghost. The trap had not just sprung, it had clamped shut with bone-crushing force. And I was holding the only key. I did not gloat. I did not laugh at the sight of my daughter-in-law standing over a pile of broken glass, shaking like a leaf in the wind. I simply stepped around the shattered crystal, ignoring her completely. I walked past my son, who was gasping for air as if the oxygen had been physically sucked out of the room. I made my way to the front of the grand ballroom, stepping up onto the raised platform with the heavy, measured strides of a man who owned the world. I stood behind the clear acrylic podium. The microphone was already on. I adjusted it slightly, and the low feedback hum snapped the wealthy audience out of their trance. They had gathered here tonight dressed in their finest tuxedos and evening gowns to be sold a dream of cutting-edge technology and boundless luxury. I was going to give them a nightmare of forensic accounting. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said. My voice rolled through the massive speakers, deep, steady, and completely devoid of any anger. "I understand you are all here to invest in the future. You have been treated to expensive champagne, beautiful music, and a very compelling story about the unstoppable rise of a brilliant technology firm. I apologize for interrupting the festivities, but as the primary stakeholder in this entire operation, I felt a moral obligation to present the quarterly financial report." I gave a slight nod to the back of the room. My corporate attorney, Graham Montgomery, was standing discreetly by the audio-visual booth. He tapped a single button on his digital tablet. The massive projection screen behind me, which had been displaying Andre's sleek corporate logo all evening, suddenly went pitch black. A second later, a high-resolution document appeared on the screen for everyone to see. It was a certified financial ledger. I do not believe in raising my voice, I told the crowd, sweeping my gaze across the silent, confused faces of the city elite. I believe in mathematics. Numbers do not possess an ego. Numbers do not lie to protect their vanity. If you look at the screen behind me, you will see the actual unedited balance sheet for my son's company. He stood before you tonight asking for your hard-earned capital to fund a global expansion. What he failed to mention is that his corporate accounts are completely frozen. I pointed to the glowing red numbers on the screen. The entire room collectively held its breath. "He is currently carrying a deficit of over $2 million, I stated clearly. His payroll bounced 48 hours ago. He owes hundreds of thousands of dollars to unsecured creditors, and his primary line of credit was terminated for fraudulent activity just this morning. He is not expanding. He is financially drowning. He brought you all here tonight hoping you would act as his unwitting life raft so he could take your money and pay off the violent underground lenders he desperately owes." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Wealthy investors who had been ready to write massive checks suddenly folded their arms and stepped away from the stage. I looked down at Andre. He was leaning heavily against a dining table, clutching his chest, looking like a man about to go into cardiac arrest. He had spent his entire adult life trying to outrun the legacy of a blue-collar father, only to be publicly dismantled by a plumber with a spreadsheet. But the deception does not end there. I continued, keeping my tone as casual as if I were reading a grocery list. "My daughter-in-law, the lovely host of this evening, also runs a business, a luxury fashion boutique that caters to many of the wonderful women in this very room." Graham tapped his tablet again. The screen changed instantly. The financial ledger was replaced by a stark official legal document stamped with the heavy red seal of Vanguard Holdings Group. Brittany let out a strangled, sobbing cry from the center of the room. She tried to cover her face with her hands, but the spotlight was already completely on her. The wealthy socialites she had desperately tried to impress were now looking at her with a mixture of absolute pity and profound disgust. "This is an emergency eviction notice," I explained to the crowd, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "It was served at 1:00 this afternoon. The boutique has not turned a single dime of profit in 4 consecutive years. The rent is severely past due, and the property owner, which happens to be me, has raised the lease by 400% to recoup the catastrophic losses. If you purchased a handbag from her this week, I would highly suggest checking your credit card statements for unauthorized charges because financial desperation breeds very poor decisions." The whispers in the crowd grew louder and more aggressive. The polished, perfect image of Atlanta's premier power couple was burning to ash in real time. Brittany sank to her knees right there in the middle of the ballroom, her expensive emerald gown pooling around her on the marble floor. Her manufactured high society life was completely obliterated. But I was not finished. I had one final nail to hammer into the coffin of their arrogance. I wanted to destroy the very foundation of their massive egos. For the past 5 years, I said, silencing the room once more, Andre and Brittany have lived a life of absolute luxury. Penthouses, designer wardrobes, exotic cars. They told everyone it was the result of their brilliant entrepreneurial skills. When Andre's company almost collapsed 2 years ago, a mysterious anonymous venture capital fund stepped in and injected $2 million to save his business. He told you he was a self-made man. He told you he built his empire with his own 2 hands. Graham tapped the tablet for the last time. A complex corporate organizational chart appeared on the massive screen. It showed the anonymous venture capital fund at the bottom. Thick red arrows pointed upward, connecting shell companies to holding trusts weaving through a labyrinth of legal financial entities. All the arrows converged at the very top of the screen, pointing directly to a single undisputed name: Tyrone Jenkins. I watched Andre's eyes track the arrows on the screen. I watched him read my name at the top of the financial food chain. The realization hit him with the force of an out-of-control freight train. The anonymous investors he had bragged about to his friends, the brilliant corporate backers who had funded his entire existence, the silent money that paid for his cars, his food, and his wife's expensive lifestyle. It was me. It was the filthy old man he had refused to acknowledge on the steps of the church. It was the father he was planning to lock inside a psychiatric ward. Andre fell to his knees beside his wife. He covered his face and began to weep. It was a pathetic, broken sound. He had finally realized that he was not a self-made tech visionary. He was just a spoiled child living on an allowance provided by a man who used to unclog toilets for a living. I let the heavy silence hang over the grand ballroom. I looked at the crowd of wealthy investors, elite socialites, and powerful politicians. They were staring at my son and his wife as if they were infected with a deadly disease. No one stepped forward to help them. In the world of high finance, failure and fraud are the ultimate sins. I leaned forward, resting my calloused hands on the edges of the clear acrylic podium. I let a cold, dark smile spread across my face as I looked directly into the camera lenses of the local business reporters standing in the back. Are you planning to invest in them? I asked the elite crowd, my voice echoing with absolute undeniable triumph. They could not even afford to buy diapers for their own child if I did not sign the checks. The grand ballroom was so incredibly quiet that I could hear the subtle hum of the massive crystal chandeliers hanging above us. The financial ledger on the giant projection screen glowed with the red numbers of my son's catastrophic debt. I watched the elite crowd process the absolute destruction of Atlanta's premier power couple. The wealthy investors and socialites who had been drinking champagne and laughing just 10 minutes ago were now staring at Andre and Brittany with expressions of pure revulsion. But true parasites never surrender quietly. When their host cuts off the blood supply, they thrash and scream. The heavy silence shattered when Brittany suddenly scrambled to her feet. Her expensive emerald gown was wrinkled. Her perfect hair was disheveled, but her sense of entitlement was still desperately fighting for survival. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "You are a monster," she screamed. Her voice cracked with a hysterical, manufactured rage that echoed off the marble walls. "You lied to us. You played twisted games with our minds. You sat in that miserable little house pretending to be poor, pretending to be sick just to trap us." She turned away from me and looked frantically at the wealthy guests surrounding her. She widened her eyes, forcing tears to stream down her pale cheeks, playing the ultimate victim. "He set us up," she pleaded to the crowd, gesturing wildly toward the podium. "He is a sociopath. He watched us struggle. He watched my husband stress over his business day and night, and he did absolutely nothing. He let us drown. He is trying to destroy his own family out of pure spite because he hates that we built a beautiful life for ourselves." I did not interrupt her. I did not yell back. I simply stood behind the clear acrylic podium and let her scream. I let her dig the hole so deep that the sunlight would never reach her again. The crowd did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. They were sharks of industry, and they knew the stench of a drowning fraud when they smelled it. When she finally ran out of breath, sobbing dramatically into her trembling hands, I leaned closer to the microphone. "I watched you struggle," I repeated, letting my deep voice roll through the speakers with perfect, terrifying calmness. "No, Brittany. I watched you buy imported Italian handbags while my son missed his corporate payroll. I watched you demand a luxury penthouse while he drowned in millions of dollars of unsecured debt. And when you finally realized the anonymous money was gone, I watched you decide that my life was an acceptable price to pay for your vanity." Brittany lowered her hands, her fake tears stopping instantly. She stared at me, a cold knot of dread forming in her throat. "You see, ladies and gentlemen," I said, addressing the captivated audience, "when a person is backed into a corner, they reveal the absolute truth of their character. My son and his wife did not come to me for honest help. They came to me for blood." I gave a slight deliberate nod to Graham Montgomery, my attorney, standing at the back of the room. He tapped his digital tablet. The financial ledger on the massive projection screen instantly vanished. It was replaced by a grainy black and white infrared video. The timestamp in the corner read 1:45 in the morning. The guests in the ballroom let out a collective gasp as they recognized the glowing white figure of Andre creeping through the shadows of my home office. "That is my son." I narrated, my voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth, using a spare key to break into my home in the dead of night while he thought I was sleeping. Watch his hands. Watch what desperation does to a man who refuses to earn an honest living. The massive screen showed Andre pulling out a metal pry bar. The high-definition audio captured the sharp, violent sound of the wood splintering as he aggressively broke the lock on my heavy mahogany desk. Whispers of absolute horror rippled through the elite crowd. Men in custom tuxedos shook their heads in disgust. "He is breaking into my private desk," I explained, keeping my eyes locked on Brittany, who was slowly backing away from the screen. "He is stealing what he believes is the original property deed to my home." His plan, orchestrated entirely by the lovely woman crying in the center of this room, was to hand that deed over to a violent syndicate of underground loan sharks. They needed $250,000 in untraceable cash by noon today, and they were perfectly willing to leave me homeless to get it. Andre was still on the floor, his knees pulled tightly up to his chest, rocking back and forth. He could not even look at the screen. He was physically shrinking, a broken shell of a man watching his own criminal soul broadcast to the world. Brittany had stopped breathing. Her face was frozen in a mask of pure, paralyzing terror. She finally realized that I did not just have financial ledgers. I had the complete, undeniable documentation of their felony crimes. But stealing the deed was only the very first phase of their brilliant survival strategy. I continued, my voice dropping to a low, deadly rumble. Because a stolen deed is extremely difficult to explain when the rightful owner wakes up and calls the police. So they decided to make absolutely sure that I would never be able to speak again. I nodded to Graham one more time. The infrared video of the break-in faded away. The massive screen went completely dark, leaving only the audio to fill the grand ballroom. The sound of my own frail, trembling voice played through the speakers, acting like a confused old man. Then came the slick, patronizing tone of the corrupt doctor they had brought into my living room. The crowd listened in dead silence as the doctor falsely diagnosed me with advanced stage dementia without performing a single valid medical test. Then the audio shifted. It captured Andre and the corrupt doctor stepping into my hallway thinking they were completely alone. The true depth of their depravity echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "The paperwork is bulletproof," the doctors recorded. Voice said loudly. "No judge in the state will question it. Now about my compensation." Then came Andre's voice, clear as crystal, devoid of any guilt. "I am sending it right now. $10,000, just like we agreed. Check your secure application." The distinct, high-pitched electronic chime of a mobile banking transfer rang out through the ballroom speakers, followed by the doctor's dark chuckle. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and visceral. People literally backed away from Brittany, leaving her standing entirely alone in a wide circle of empty marble floor. The wealthy investors who had been shaking Andre's hand an hour ago looked as though they were watching a monster. The disgust in the room was a physical weight pressing down on my son and his wife until they could barely breathe. I looked down from his podium, staring directly into the terrified eyes of the people who had plotted to erase my existence. "You did not just want to steal my home," I said, projecting my voice so every single person in the room felt the gravity of their crimes. "You hired a criminal fraud to declare me mentally incompetent. You planned to drug me into a chemical stupor. You were going to lock me in the lowest level of a state-run psychiatric ward so you could seize emergency guardianship of my assets and continue paying for your pathetic, empty lifestyle. You were going to bury me alive." Andre let out a guttural, agonizing wail. He buried his face against the cold floor, completely and utterly broken. Brittany was shaking her head frantically, holding her hands over her ears, muttering to herself that this could not be happening, that it was all a terrible nightmare. "It is happening, Brittany," I said, my words striking her like physical blows. "You wanted to play in the major leagues. You wanted the power, the prestige, and the elite social status. But you forgot the most important rule of the game. When you try to slaughter a giant in his sleep, you better make absolutely certain he is not watching you with one eye open. You thought I was a filthy old man. You thought I was weak. But I am the man who built the very walls that are currently closing in on you." The heavy, suffocating silence of the ballroom was suddenly broken. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance, cutting sharply through the crisp night air. Within seconds, the sound multiplied and grew deafeningly loud. Red and blue lights began to flash wildly against the towering glass windows of the Grand Hotel. The police sirens were not just passing by. They were pulling directly into the sweeping driveway, converging on the front entrance in a massive, coordinated swarm. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the towering glass windows of the grand ballroom, casting long, frantic shadows across the marble floor. The heavy, suffocating silence inside the room was violently shattered by the sound of heavy boots marching purposefully up the front steps of the hotel. The elite crowd of investors and socialites practically climbed over each other to clear a path. They scrambled away from the center of the room, pressing their backs against the expensive silk wallpaper, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive epicenters of fraud that were my son and his wife. The massive mahogany doors were thrust open. A team of law enforcement officers entered the ballroom with absolute, undeniable authority. There were uniformed city police officers forming a perimeter, their hands resting firmly on their duty belts. Leading them were two federal detectives in sharp, dark suits, their badges gleaming brightly under the crystal chandeliers. The static chatter of their police radios cut through the dead air, a harsh, mechanical sound that completely destroyed whatever remained of the high society atmosphere. I stood behind the clear, acrylic podium, my hands resting lightly on the edges. I did not move. I did not flinch. I had orchestrated this exact moment with my legal team, and now I was simply watching the final act of the play unfold. The lead detective, a tall man with a hardened face and graying hair, walked straight down the center aisle. He did not look at the wealthy guests. He did not look at the lavish decorations. His eyes were locked directly on my son. Andre was still on the floor. He was kneeling in the wreckage of his own arrogance, his expensive tuxedo wrinkled and defeated. He looked up at the approaching detectives, his face completely devoid of blood. He looked like a man standing on the tracks watching the train barrel toward him, realizing his legs were entirely paralyzed. Andre Jenkins, the lead detective, said, his voice deep and completely devoid of sympathy. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a folded stack of official warrants. "You are under arrest. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Andre did not move. He could not move. His entire nervous system was completely overloaded by the catastrophic reality of his situation. He just stared at the detective, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The detective did not wait for compliance. He gestured to two uniformed officers who immediately stepped forward. They grabbed Andre by the arms and hauled him forcefully to his feet. My son offered absolutely no resistance. He hung limply in their grasp, a hollow shell of the arrogant technology executive he had pretended to be just an hour ago. "You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud," the detective announced, reading from the official document. "You are also charged with conspiracy to commit bank fraud, the forgery of certified medical documents, and the organized attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable senior citizen." The words echoed through the ballroom, sealing his fate in front of every single person he had ever tried to impress. The elite crowd gasped. The wealthy investors shook their heads in absolute disgust. One of the officers pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He grabbed Andre's right wrist, twisting it firmly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel teeth locking into place sounded like a vault door slamming shut. He grabbed the left wrist, and a second click echoed through the room. My son was in handcuffs, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had worked double shifts to put through college. He was now a common criminal bound in steel heading to a federal penitentiary. I felt a sharp, heavy ache deep in the center of my chest. It was the last remaining fragment of a father's broken heart. But I swallowed the pain, locking it away behind a wall of cold, unyielding justice. He had chosen this path. I was merely holding him accountable to the destination. And then the true nature of the woman he had sacrificed his soul for was finally revealed. Brittany had been standing just a few feet away, frozen in terror. But when she heard the metallic click of the handcuffs, a primal, selfish survival instinct kicked in. She did not rush to her husband's side. She did not cry out for mercy or tell the officers there had been a terrible mistake. She did exactly what parasites do when their host begins to die. She detached herself immediately. She scrambled backward, her high heels slipping on the marble floor. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Andre, her face twisted in a mask of manufactured panic and desperate self-preservation. "It was him!" Brittany screamed, her shrill voice slicing through the heavy tension of the ballroom. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this. He forced me to go along with it. He is a monster. He lied to me about everything. I did not know he forged those medical papers. I did not know he was stealing from his father. I am innocent." Andre slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The color had already drained from his face, but now the very light behind his eyes completely extinguished. He looked at the woman he had leased penthouses for, the woman he had bought exotic cars for, the woman who had demanded he break into my home and steal my property deed to save her failing boutique. He had betrayed his own father to secure her love, and at the very first sign of consequence, she was feeding him directly to the wolves. Brittany Andre whispered, his voice cracking, a single tear spilling over his eyelashes and rolling down his cheek. "How can you say that? It was your idea." "You found the doctor! Shut up!" Brittany shrieked, taking another step backward, wildly gesturing to the detectives. "Do not listen to him. He is a pathological liar. He is trying to drag me down with him. I am a mother. I am a victim of his financial abuse. Please, you have to believe me. I knew nothing about his illegal schemes." The sheer audacity of her betrayal was breathtaking. She was willing to burn the father of her child alive just to save her own skin. The wealthy guests watching the scene looked physically nauseated by her display of profound cowardice. The lead detective looked at Brittany with eyes that held absolutely zero respect. He signaled to his officers. "Take Mr. Jenkins out to the transport vehicle," he ordered. "We have everything we need to process him tonight." The officers turned Andre around and began marching him down the center aisle. The crowd parted, avoiding eye contact with the disgraced executive. Andre kept his head hung low, his shoulders slumped, dragging his feet across the polished floor. He did not look back at his wife. He did not look back at me. He simply walked into the flashing red and blue lights of his own destruction. Brittany let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief as she watched her husband being hauled away. She actually thought she had won. She thought her hysterical performance had convinced the detectives that she was an innocent bystander. She smoothed down the front of her expensive emerald gown, wiped the fake tears from her eyes, and let out a nervous, triumphant little laugh. I stepped down from the raised platform. I walked slowly across the ballroom floor, the sound of my leather shoes echoing in the quiet room. The guests stepped back, giving me a wide, respectful berth. I approached Brittany. She looked up at me, her eyes darting nervously. She opened her mouth, perhaps preparing to weave another web of lies, trying to convince me that she was just a helpless pawn in Andre's vicious game. I did not let her speak. I stopped just 2 feet away from her. I looked down at her terrified, shallow face. I looked at the expensive pearls around her neck that my secret funds had paid for. "You are a very talented actress, Brittany," I said, my voice dangerously low, meant only for her ears. "You threw your husband to the wolves with remarkable speed. But you forgot one very important detail." She swallowed hard, her chest heaving as panic began to rebuild in her throat. What she whispered. I leaned in closer, my expression carved from absolute ice. "I did not just record his conversations. I recorded yours. I have the audio of you specifically demanding he steal my property deed. I have the audio of you orchestrating my false imprisonment in a psychiatric ward. The federal prosecutors have every single file." Her eyes widened in sheer paralyzing horror. Then she looked frantically toward the exit, looking for the detectives. "Then why did they not arrest me?" she stammered, her voice trembling violently. "Why did they leave me here?" I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. "Because I explicitly asked my attorneys to delay your arrest warrant for exactly 48 hours, I whispered. "You are not getting arrested tonight, Brittany. I am not going to let you hide in a quiet holding cell while your world burns." She stared at me, completely failing to understand the depth of her punishment. "You see," I continued smoothly, "Vanguard Holdings Group officially executed the eviction on your luxury boutique an hour ago. The commercial locks have been changed. Your entire inventory has been seized to cover back rent. You have absolutely zero income. Your credit cards are frozen. Your husband is going to federal prison. And you have no access to the anonymous venture capital that paid for your lavish lifestyle." I took a slight step back, looking her up and down with the exact same expression of physical revulsion she had given me on the church steps. "You are not getting arrested tonight," I repeated, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable finality. "Because you are going to have to wake up tomorrow morning entirely alone and face the $500,000 debt of your boutique all by yourself. You are going to watch the bank take your penthouse, your cars, and every designer item you own. You are going to experience exactly what it feels like to be nothing more than a filthy, broke outcast. Good luck." The next 48 hours played out exactly as I had orchestrated. The swift and brutal machinery of the justice system took full control of my son. Andre was denied bail. The federal prosecutor argued that because of his demonstrated willingness to forge legal documents and his deep ties to underground lending syndicates, he was a massive flight risk. I received a brief update from my attorney, Graham. Andre was sitting in a sterile concrete holding cell wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. His expensive tailored suits were sitting in an evidence locker. The high-powered defense lawyers he tried to call had all hung up the moment they realized his corporate accounts were frozen and his personal assets were seized. He was completely alone, facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The tech visionary was now just inmate number 8042. While Andre was experiencing the cold reality of a jail cell, his wife was experiencing a completely different kind of hell on the outside. I had given Brittany a 48-hour head start before the federal warrants caught up to her, but that time was not a gift. It was a carefully designed psychological torture. The morning after the gala, the property management team arrived at her luxury penthouse with local sheriffs to execute an emergency eviction. The banks had already frozen her joint accounts. She had no money to pay the staggering arrears. Brittany was given exactly 2 hours to pack whatever personal belongings she could fit into a few bags and vacate the premises. The woman who used to travel with matching sets of Louis Vuitton luggage was forced to stuff her clothes into heavy-duty black plastic garbage bags. I had private investigators monitoring her movements, sending me regular updates. The reports painted a picture of absolute frantic desperation. Brittany tried to call her wealthy parents the same old money family she always bragged about, but it turned out her parents were drowning in their own massive debts and wanted absolutely nothing to do with a daughter facing federal fraud charges. They refused to wire her a single dime. She tried reaching out to her elite social circle, the women she used to drink expensive champagne with at country clubs. Every single one of them sent her calls directly to voicemail. In the ruthless world of high society, nobody wants to catch the scent of a sinking ship. With nowhere to go and the massive $500,000 debt from her seized boutique hanging over her head, Brittany resorted to a humiliating fire sale. The investigators sent me photos of her standing in the parking lot of a cheap strip mall on the outskirts of the city. She was pulling designer handbags, diamond bracelets, and limited edition shoes out of the trunk of a rented economy car. She was selling her entire manufactured identity to shady pawnshop dealers and secondhand consignment buyers for pennies on the dollar. The items she had purchased with my stolen money to feel superior were now being traded just so she could afford a room in a dilapidated roadside motel. She was experiencing the exact poverty she had mocked me for. As for myself, I had finally decided to drop the grand illusion. I packed up the few sentimental items I wanted to keep from my modest brick house in the suburbs and officially moved into my primary residence. It was a sprawling, ultra-secure estate nestled deep within the exclusive wooded hills of Buckhead. It was a property I had purchased 10 years ago under a corporate trust but rarely visited, preferring the quiet anonymity of my working-class neighborhood. But anonymity was no longer necessary. The fortress was surrounded by tall stone walls, heavy wrought iron gates, and a state-of-the-art security system. I was finally living in the castle I had built with 40 years of blood and sweat. On the morning of the 4th day, I was sitting in my expansive glass-walled study, overlooking the manicured grounds of my estate. I held a cup of dark roast coffee in my hand. The security monitors mounted on my desk suddenly chimed with a perimeter alert. I leaned forward and looked at the high-definition feed from the main gate cameras. A beat-up yellow taxi had just pulled up to the edge of my property. The rear door opened, and a woman stepped out onto the asphalt. It took me a moment to recognize her. It was Brittany. She looked absolutely devastated. The immaculate, perfectly styled socialite was entirely gone. She was wearing baggy gray sweatpants and a stained, oversized sweater. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, tangled knot. She had dark, heavy bags under her bloodshot eyes. She looked like she had not slept in days. The taxi driver yelled something out the window, likely asking for his fare, but Brittany ignored him and stumbled toward the massive iron gates of my estate. She grabbed the thick iron bars with both hands, shaking them weakly. She looked up at the security camera mounted on the stone pillar. I pressed a button on my desk console, activating the two-way audio feed, but I kept my microphone muted so I could simply listen. "Tyrone," she cried out, her voice raw and hoarse. "Tyrone, please. I know you are in there. The lawyers told me this is your property. You have to help me." She pressed her face against the cold metal bars, tears streaming down her pale, unwashed cheeks. I sat in my comfortable leather chair, watching her break down in high definition. "They are coming for me today," she sobbed hysterically, her grip tightening on the gates. "The federal agents are coming to arrest me. I do not have a lawyer. I do not have any money. I slept in my rental car last night. Please, Tyrone. I am the mother of your grandson. You cannot let them put me in a cage. I will do anything you want. I will sign whatever documents you need. Just please open the gate. Give me a place to hide. Give me money for a defense attorney." The sheer audacity of her presence at my home was staggering. This was the same woman who had conspired to strip me of my freedom and lock me in a psychiatric ward. This was the woman who had demanded my son steal the deed to my house. And now, stripped of all her stolen armor, she was begging for sanctuary at the very gates of the man she had tried to destroy. Brittany sank to her knees on the hard, unforgiving asphalt. She buried her face in her hands, weeping loudly, a pathetic display of absolute defeat. "Please," she wailed, her voice echoing through the external microphones. "I am begging you. I have nothing left. Do not leave me out here like trash." I looked at the screen for a long, quiet moment. I thought about my grandson Leo, and the necessary steps I would be taking to ensure he was placed in proper loving care once the state removed him from this toxic environment. I felt absolutely no pity for the woman kneeling on the pavement. Empathy is reserved for those who simply make mistakes. Brittany had not made a mistake. She had executed a malicious, calculated campaign of abuse. I reached out and pressed the intercom button on my console. The small green light indicated my microphone was live. My deep, calm voice projected through the external speakers mounted above the iron gates. Brittany slowly raised her head. She looked up at the camera, a flicker of desperate hope shining in her exhausted, bloodshot eyes. She thought she had finally broken through. She thought the soft, forgiving heart of a grandfather was about to save her. I leaned closely into the microphone. "Your clothes are far too dirty, Brittany," I said, my voice echoing off the stone pillars with absolute freezing finality. "There is no place for filthy people here." I released the button. I watched her eyes widen in sheer horror as she recognized the exact words she had spit at me on the marble steps of the church just a few days ago. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The gates were never going to open. There would be no mercy. There would only be the brutal, devastating consequences of her own arrogance. I reached over and completely turned off the security monitor. The screen went pitch black, plunging her pathetic image into the dark. I picked up my coffee mug, took a slow, satisfying sip, and turned my attention back to the beautiful morning sunlight spilling across my estate. Brittany's breakdown at my gates was only the beginning of her free fall. When a parasite is detached from its host, it does not just starve, it panics. 2 days after she wept on my asphalt, the authorities finally intervened. Child Protective Services does not care about your former zip code or the designer labels on your garbage bags. They care about the environment you provide for a child. And the environment Brittany was providing for my infant grandson Leo was a hazardous cocktail of extreme poverty, psychological collapse, and impending federal indictments. Social workers found her living out of her rented economy car in the parking lot of a budget motel. She had no money for baby formula. She was completely hysterical, screaming at the social workers about how she was secretly a millionaire, about how her father-in-law was a vindictive billionaire who had stolen her life. To the trained professionals, she sounded like a severe psychiatric case experiencing a paranoid break from reality. They did not hesitate. They placed little Leo in emergency protective custody. The moment I received the call from my legal team, I moved with the full, devastating weight of my empire. I was not going to let my grandson spend a single night in the foster care system. He was a Jenkins, he was my blood, and I was going to bring him home. The family court building in downtown Atlanta is a bleak, depressing place where broken families fight over the scraps of ruined lives. When I walked through the metal detectors the following morning, I did not look like a man fighting for scraps. I wore a tailored charcoal suit and walked flanked by 3 of the most ruthless, high-powered family law attorneys in the state of Georgia. We entered the courtroom. Brittany was already seated at the respondent's table. The contrast between us was almost cruel. She sat slumped in a cheap, wrinkled blouse, her hair greasy and unkempt. Next to her sat a court-appointed public defender who looked completely exhausted and severely underpaid. When the judge called the emergency custody hearing to order, it was a legal massacre. My attorneys presented a fortress of documentation. They handed the judge certified copies of my background checks, which were absolutely spotless. They provided a comprehensive portfolio of my massive financial assets, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that I could provide the child with a life of unparalleled stability and privilege. They showed photographs of my heavily secured, sprawling estate in Buckhead, complete with a fully furnished nursery and a licensed pediatric nurse I had already placed on a hefty retainer. Then they presented Brittany's reality: the public eviction, the $500,000 in commercial debt, the frozen bank accounts, the pending federal investigation for wire fraud and conspiracy. The judge did not even need to deliberate. Within 15 minutes, I was granted immediate full temporary physical custody of my grandson. But temporary was a word I despised. Temporary meant Brittany still had a legal thread attached to my family. It meant that in the future, if she somehow managed to avoid prison, she could drag me back into court and use Leo as a pawn to extract money from my estate. I was not going to allow that toxic woman to have a single drop of leverage over my bloodline ever again. I wanted absolute, permanent control. I instructed my lead attorney to request a brief recess and invite Brittany and her public defender into a private mediation room down the hall. The small, windowless conference room smelled of cheap coffee and stale anxiety. I sat at the head of the long wooden table. My lawyer stood silently behind me like an impenetrable wall. Brittany walked into the room, her public defender trailing nervously behind her. She looked hollowed out. The arrogant, untouchable socialite who had blocked the church doors and called me a filthy old man was completely dead, but the manipulative survivor inside her was still twitching. She sat down across from me, crossing her arms defensively. "You cannot keep my son from me forever, Tyrone," she said, her voice shaking but trying to project a false sense of defiance. "I am his mother. The courts always favor the mother. Once I clear up this misunderstanding with the banks, I am going to get him back. You cannot buy a child." I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I calmly reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, legally binding document. I slid it across the smooth surface of the table until it stopped directly in front of her. "I am not buying a child, Brittany," I said smoothly. "I am buying your permanent exit from his life." She looked down at the document. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, "Voluntary relinquishment of parental rights." Her eyes widened. "You are insane," she hissed, pushing the paper away. "I will never sign this. You are trying to steal my baby." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "You have nothing to offer that boy except trauma, poverty, and the suffocating weight of your own narcissism." I told her, my voice cold and surgical, "But I understand that you are motivated purely by self-preservation. So let me explain the mathematics of your current situation." I pulled out a second document. This one was heavily stamped with the red seal of Vanguard Holdings Group. "I personally purchased the $500,000 debt from your failed boutique," I explained, watching the blood drain from her already pale face. "You owe that money directly to me. Additionally, my legal team has fully prepared a massive civil lawsuit against you for elder abuse, emotional distress, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud." I let the weight of those words sink in before I delivered the final, crushing blow. "Option A," I continued, "is that you refuse to sign away your parental rights. If you choose that path, we go to court. I will absolutely destroy you in civil litigation. I will garnish any wages you make for the rest of your natural life. And more importantly, I will hand over the specific high-definition audio recordings of you orchestrating my fake psychiatric hold directly to the federal prosecutors handling Andre's case. You will join your husband in federal prison for the next decade. And while you are sitting in a concrete cell, the state will permanently terminate your parental rights anyway." Brittany stopped breathing. Her public defender looked down at his shoes, offering absolutely no defense because he knew I had her perfectly trapped. "Option B," I said, tapping my finger on the relinquishment form. "You sign this document right now. You surrender all legal and physical custody of Leo to me permanently and irrevocably. In exchange, I forgive the $500,000 commercial debt. I drop the civil lawsuit. And I withhold your specific audio files from the federal prosecutor, allowing you to walk out of this courthouse today as a free, albeit completely broke woman." The room was dead silent. I could see the frantic calculations racing behind her bloodshot eyes. She was a coward. She had always been a coward. When faced with the terrifying reality of a federal prison sentence, her maternal instincts evaporated like water on a hot stove. She looked at the pen resting on the table. "If I sign this," she whispered, her voice breaking, "you will not send me to prison. You will be completely erased from our lives," I confirmed. "You will walk away with your freedom, but you will never see Leo again. You will never contact him, and you will never receive a single dime of Jenkins' money." Her trembling hand reached out and picked up the pen. She did not cry for the son she was giving away. She cried for the luxury she was officially losing. She pressed the pen to the paper and signed her name on the dotted line. My attorney immediately pulled the document away, placing it safely into his briefcase. The deal was done. The victory was absolute. Brittany stood up, pushing her chair back. She looked at me, a hollow, empty shell of a human being. She had surrendered her own child just to save her skin. "I hope you are happy, Tyrone," she choked out, turning toward the door. I stood up, adjusting my custom suit jacket. I looked at the woman who had tried to bury me alive. "I am extremely happy, Brittany," I said, my voice echoing with profound finality, "because you just traded the only valuable thing you ever produced to save yourself. And in doing so, you severed the absolute last connection you had to my family. You are nothing to us now. The door is behind you. Do not ever let me see your face again." The salty breeze of the Atlantic Ocean swept across the private shoreline of my coastal estate in South Carolina. It was early morning, and the sun was just beginning to paint the horizon in brilliant strokes of gold and crimson. I walked slowly along the pristine white sand, feeling the gentle rhythm of the waves crashing against the shore. My bare feet sank into the cool, wet earth. In my arms, wrapped snugly in a thick woolen blanket, was my grandson, Leo. He was fast asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with perfect, untroubled peace. I looked down at his beautiful, innocent face. He had my late wife's nose and my own strong jawline. He was completely unaware of the massive storm that had just wiped out the toxic foundation of his previous life. He was safe. He was finally home. I had spent the entire previous week sitting in the mahogany boardroom of my legal team in Atlanta, drafting a document that would ensure this boy never became a victim of his parents' greed. I built a financial fortress around Leo, an ironclad trust fund completely impervious to any legal attacks. The Jenkins Family Trust was officially endowed with $50 million, but the money came with absolute unbreakable conditions. Leo would not see a single penny of that wealth until his 25th birthday. I was not going to hand a massive fortune to a child and watch it rot his character the way it had corrupted his father. To unlock the trust, he had to meet strict requirements. He had to graduate from an accredited university. He had to complete 2 full years of documented unpaid public community service. He had to learn what it felt like to serve people who had nothing to look the most vulnerable members of society in the eye and understand the true value of human dignity. He needed to understand that real wealth is not measured by the luxury cars you drive or the designer clothes you wear, but by the impact you have on the world around you. And most importantly, my lawyers inserted a venomous legal clause designed specifically for Andre and Brittany. If either of his biological parents ever attempted to access the fund, challenge the trust in court, or coerce Leo into handing over his inheritance, the entire $50 million would instantly liquidate and be donated anonymously to a dozen different charities. Not a single drop of my wealth would ever quench their thirst. The barrier was permanent. They were legally and financially locked out of his life forever. I carried Leo up the wooden stairs from the beach to the massive wraparound porch of my oceanfront home. I gently placed him in his shaded outdoor crib, watching him sleep for a moment longer. Then I walked into my study and sat down in my favorite leather chair. The silence of the morning was absolute perfection. I poured myself a cup of rich black coffee and looked out over the water. But then the heavy black phone on my desk began to ring. I looked at the caller identification screen. It was an incoming call from a federal penitentiary facility. I let it ring 3 times before I slowly picked up the receiver and held it to my ear. An automated mechanical voice informed me that I had a collect call from an inmate at the federal detention center. I pressed the button to accept the charges. The line clicked with a sharp burst of static, and then I heard the sound of a man weeping uncontrollably. It was Andre. "Dad," he sobbed, his voice echoing off the sterile concrete walls of his federal holding cell. "Dad, please do not hang up on me. I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything. It is an absolute nightmare in here. The food, the guards, the other inmates. I am terrified, Dad. Please, I know I messed up. I know I betrayed you, but I am your son. You cannot leave me in here. Please hire a defense team for me. Please get me out of this place." I sat in the quiet comfort of my study, listening to the desperate pleas of the man who had tried to bury me alive. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel the sharp, burning sting of betrayal. I felt a profound, heavy sorrow for the bright young boy he used to be, and a complete emotional detachment from the criminal he had actively chosen to become. He cried for 10 straight minutes, begging for a massive financial bailout. He begged for the fatherly protection he had so casually discarded when he thought I was just a broke, useless plumber standing on the steps of a church. He promised he would change his ways. He promised he would work in my commercial real estate office for free. He promised he would do absolutely anything to avoid spending the next 10 to 15 years in a federal prison. When he finally stopped crying, gasping for air, and desperately waiting for my response, I leaned forward and spoke directly into the receiver. "I am glad you are finally recognizing the heavy weight of your choices, Andre." I said, my voice completely steady and completely devoid of any mercy. "You are going to have a lot of time to reflect on the man you decided to be. I suggest you use that time wisely. Rehabilitate yourself, learn a trade, read books in the prison library, figure out how to become a better human being. Dad, please," he whimpered, sensing the absolute terrifying finality in my tone. "I taught you how to walk when you were a baby." "Andre," I continued, cutting off his pathetic excuses completely. "I held your hand and showed you how to put one foot in front of the other so you would not fall. But I cannot walk this path for you. You are a grown man. You have to teach yourself how to take responsibility for your own life." I did not wait for his response. I did not want to hear another manufactured promise or another desperate, hollow plea. I slowly lowered the receiver and placed it gently back onto the cradle. The heavy click of the disconnected line echoed in the quiet room, sealing his fate permanently. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked out the massive glass windows at the rolling blue waves of the ocean. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for the past 5 years was completely gone. I did not have to pretend to be a weak, confused old man anymore. I did not have to wear faded brown suits or hide my massive intellect behind a carefully crafted mask of humble poverty. I did not have to listen to the toxic, arrogant insults of a daughter-in-law who mistakenly thought her manufactured social status made her better than me. I took a deep breath, letting the fresh ocean air fill my lungs. The physical relief was absolutely staggering. My shoulders relaxed. The tension in my jaw faded away. For the first time in an incredibly long time, the world was perfectly, beautifully quiet. The stage lights were finally turned off, and the curtain had officially closed on the greatest, most exhausting performance of my entire life. I was no longer playing a role. I was just Tyrone Jenkins, a wealthy, powerful, and absolutely peaceful grandfather. And as I listened to the soft, gentle breathing of baby Leo coming from the porch, I knew that the legacy of my family was finally safe. The sun had completely surrendered to the night. I sat alone on the sweeping wooden balcony of my coastal estate, listening to the eternal rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic waves against the shoreline. In my right hand, I held a heavy crystal glass filled with a very rare, deeply aged bourbon. I took a slow sip. The dark amber liquid burned pleasantly down my throat, a stark contrast to the cold, calculating ice that had run through my veins for the past few weeks. The night air was thick with the smell of salt and sweet jasmine. For the first time in years, my shoulders were entirely relaxed. I was no longer carrying the crushing invisible weight of my son's manufactured empire. A few feet away, sheltered from the evening breeze, my grandson Leo slept soundly in his handcrafted wooden cradle. I stood up from my chair and walked over to him, my bare feet silent against the smooth balcony floorboards. I leaned over the rail of the crib. His tiny chest rose and fell in a perfectly peaceful rhythm. He had his tiny hands balled into little fists, dreaming whatever pure, untroubled dreams a child has before the world teaches them about greed and betrayal. I reached out and gently brushed a soft curl of hair from his forehead. He did not stir. He was completely safe. He would never know the toxic, suffocating vanity of the woman who birthed him, and he would never inherit the fragile, cowardly ego of the man who fathered him. I had burned their corrupted world to the ground so that this little boy could build a real one on solid rock. As I looked at Leo, my mind drifted back to the marble steps of that imposing Atlanta church. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet it had only been a matter of days. I thought about the faded brown suit I had worn. I thought about the absolute disgust in Brittany's eyes when she looked at me, a man she deemed too filthy, too poor, too insignificant to stand in her presence. She had measured my entire human worth by the scuffed leather of my shoes and the frayed edges of my collar. She had no idea that true power does not need to announce itself with designer labels or expensive champagne. True power is quiet. It observes. It waits. And when it is disrespected, it strikes with a devastating, undeniable precision. And then there was Andre, my son, the boy I had sacrificed my youth for. I had crawled through mud and freezing water to fix broken pipes so he could walk across manicured university lawns. I had hidden my massive wealth because I desperately wanted him to learn the profound value of a hard-earned dollar. I wanted him to understand that a man is defined by his character, not his bank account. But I had made a critical, almost fatal error. When his technology company was collapsing, I bailed him out. I pumped millions of anonymous dollars into his business to protect his pride. I thought I was being a good father. But all I did was feed his arrogance. I gave him a golden crutch, and he used it to walk all over the people who loved him. He allowed his toxic wife to humiliate me because he had forgotten what real strength looked like. He sold his soul for the illusion of high society. Now he was sitting in a sterile concrete federal cell, stripped of his luxury suits and his false bravado. He was facing the brutal, undeniable consequences of his own actions. It broke my heart to see him in those steel handcuffs. A father never wants to see his child destroyed. But sometimes a father has to tear down the rotten house his son has built before it collapses and crushes the innocent people trapped inside it. By sending Andre to prison, I had ultimately saved him from himself. He would finally have to learn how to stand on his own 2 feet without my anonymous money holding him up. And Brittany, stripped of her boutique, her penthouse, and her child, was wandering the streets of a reality she had always mocked. She traded her son to avoid a prison sentence, proving exactly what kind of hollow shell existed inside her chest. I walked back to my leather chair and sat down, taking another slow sip of my bourbon. The liquid warmed my chest. The sprawling estate behind me was quiet and secure. My legal team had executed every single maneuver with flawless precision. The fake medical documents, the corrupt doctor, the stolen property deed, it had all been systematically dismantled and turned into the very weapons that destroyed my enemies. I had reclaimed my dignity, and I had secured my grandson's future. The $50 million trust fund waiting for Leo was not just a pile of cash. It was a carefully designed roadmap to building a good, honorable man. He would have to work for it. He would have to serve his community. He would have to learn empathy, humility, and respect. Money is a strange, terrifying thing. It does not change who you are. It acts as a massive magnifying glass, amplifying whatever is already inside your heart. If you are a good, generous person, money allows you to build hospitals and protect your family. But if you are hollow, greedy, and vain, money will turn you into a monster. It will convince you that you are superior to the people who wipe your floors and fix your pipes. It will convince you that you can betray your own blood for a slightly bigger penthouse or a newer luxury car. Andre and Brittany were poisoned by a wealth they did not even earn. They drowned in a sea of my money because they never learned how to swim in the harsh waters of reality. I raised my glass to the dark ocean horizon, offering a silent toast to the hard lessons of the past and the peaceful promise of the future. The filthy old man from the church steps was gone forever. Tyrone Jenkins, the plumber, the father, the silent giant, was finally at absolute peace. Blood makes you related, but respect makes you family. We often mask our greed with the illusion of love, believing that the elderly are silent trees waiting to be chopped down for firewood. But wisdom does not decay with age, it sharpens. I learned that you cannot buy character, and you certainly cannot shield an ungrateful child from the brutal consequences of their own arrogance. Sometimes the purest act of love a father can give is to step aside and let the world teach the lessons that his wealth could not. Dignity is not inherited, it is earned. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace? Share your experiences in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and remember to always protect your dignity.